I had rented the cabin because I wanted peace. Not the kind of peace that you get for an hour in your living room before something interrupts you, but the heavy, steady kind of silence that presses against you in the woods. The kind where the only sound you hear is the crunch of snow under your boots or the creak of an old beam when the wind changes. The cabin was small, no more than 30 feet long from front to back, with 2 rooms, a combined kitchen and living area, and a bedroom with a narrow hallway leading to a bathroom. The furniture was old but solid. The air smelled faintly of cedar, dry firewood stacked neatly in the stone hearth. The place sat half a mile from the narrow dirt road, which itself was miles from the main highway. That stretch of road twisted through a thick line of pine and spruce trees until it met the cabin clearing. In the winter, the only way in was to park at the plowed turnoff and hike the rest of the way in through the snow. That was part of the appeal. I had planned to spend 5 nights there in late January. I had brought food, firewood, an axe, a few books, a notebook, a thermos, extra blankets, and the kind of heavy winter clothes you only wear when you know you'll be away from people for a while. The first day was calm. I unpacked, lit a fire, and settled into the rhythm of listening to wind in the trees and the occasional thump of snow sliding off the roof. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun went down. Outside, the snow glowed pale under a moon that seemed too bright for such a remote place. By the second day, the silence started to feel heavier. I noticed how every sound carried. My boots on the wood floor, the clink of a mug on the counter, the faint crackle from the fireplace. I could hear my own breathing at night and the shifting of the cabin as it responded to the cold. That night, I was reading when I heard it for the first time. A faint crunching sound outside, in the snow. At first, I thought it was just snow sliding from a tree branch, but the sound was too steady. Slow, deliberate steps. They started far enough away that I barely noticed, but they grew louder, closer. The steps stopped near the front of the cabin. I set my book down and waited, holding my breath. I didn't move toward the window. I just listened. After a long pause, there was the faint sound of snow shifting again, but this time moving away. I told myself it could have been a deer or maybe a fox. Animals moved through here all the time. Still, when I went to bed, I double-checked the front door latch and the single bolt lock. The cabin had no security system. There was no cell service. If something happened out here, you dealt with it yourself. The third day, I decided to check for tracks. In the pale morning light, I found a line of deep footprints in the snow leading up to the front steps. They weren't animal tracks, they were clearly made by boots. The stride was wide, and the snow was packed down in each print as though the person had stood in place for a moment. The trail came from the treeline about 30 yards out, approached the cabin, stopped near the front porch, and then turned away toward the same section of trees. There were no other prints. I followed them for a short distance into the woods, but the snow was knee-deep and the cold cut through my gloves. After 50 feet or so, I turned back. Whoever it was, they hadn't knocked, hadn't left anything, hadn't done anything except come close enough to the cabin to stand there. That day, I kept myself busy cutting firewood. My mind kept circling back to the prints, though. I told myself that maybe a hiker had gotten turned around and used the cabin as a landmark. But in this weather and this far out, no casual hiker would be wandering by. That night, I stayed up later than usual, reading and making notes in my notebook. Around midnight, I heard the same sound again, the crunch of snow under boots. My stomach tightened. I closed my book and sat still. The steps came from the same direction, slow and deliberate. This time, they circled the cabin. I could hear them on the far side, then moving toward the back. There was a faint scuff against the wall, like someone brushing a shoulder or hand against it. The steps continued until they were back at the front. I sat in the chair for a long time after the sound stopped. I didn't look out the window. I didn't want whoever it was to see movement inside. In the morning, I checked again. There were fresh prints on all sides of the cabin. Some came uncomfortably close to the bedroom window. I decided that if it happened again, I would be ready. I kept the axe propped near the front door. I made sure my flashlight worked and placed it within reach. The fourth day passed in a tense quiet. I stayed mostly inside, only going out briefly to bring in more firewood and to check the sky. The weather was changing. Clouds had gathered and the air felt heavier. Snow was coming. That night, the sound returned. The steps were slower this time, almost hesitant. They paused for long stretches, as if the person was standing and listening. At one point, I heard a faint, high creak, wood under weight. The porch. They were on the porch. The sound of boots on wood is different from boots on snow. It's sharper, more hollow. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like minutes. I could almost hear the faint sound of their breathing through the door, though it might have been my own heart pounding. Then, after a long silence, the sound faded again. The steps retreated into the trees. The next morning, I found something on the porch. A single glove, old and worn, with the leather cracked. I hadn't seen it before. It hadn't been there when I came in with firewood the previous day. By then, my trip was only supposed to last one more night, but the snow was already starting to fall. If I left now, I would have to hike back to the road in worsening weather and hope my car could make it out before the drifts got too deep. I stayed. That evening, the snow fell harder. The wind picked up. The fire in the hearth became the only warmth in the cabin. I sat with my back to the wall, facing the door, the axe within reach. Hours passed. The storm made it hard to hear, but sometime after midnight, I caught the muffled crunch of snow again. The sound was faint at first, almost lost under the wind, but it grew. Slow, steady, closer. Then it stopped. A minute passed. 2, 3. The sound started again, but now it was different. Quicker, more direct. Came right up to the porch. I heard the wood creak. A sudden heavy thud hit the door. Not a knock, just weight against it. Another thud followed, then the sound of the latch shifting. Someone was trying the door. The bolt held. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. The wind howled outside. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the pressure on the door was gone. I stayed in that chair until the first pale light came through the windows. When I opened the door, there was nothing on the porch but a drift of fresh snow. The wind had erased the prints. That morning, I packed. The snow had eased enough for me to make the hike back to the road. The walk felt longer than before, every sound in the woods making me glance over my shoulder. When I reached my car, there were fresh prints in the snow beside it. Boots. The tracks circled the car once, then disappeared into the trees. I drove until the cabin was miles behind me. I never found out who it was. There was no note, no sign, no reason. Just the prints, the glove, and the sound of slow, careful steps in the snow. I never went back. I had been driving for almost 4 hours before I finally reached the long dirt road that cut through Dry Pine Hollow. It was early October, the kind of cold where the air feels sharp but not freezing, and the sky had been gray all day. I had rented the cabin for a week, wanting time away from work, noise, and people. I didn't tell many people exactly where I was going. I liked the idea of being alone. The road to the cabin was barely wide enough for my truck, with deep ruts from rainwater that had dried into hard grooves. On each side were thick pine trees, leaning in like they wanted to swallow the road. My GPS had lost signal almost an hour earlier. I had nothing but the old printed directions from the rental listing. The trees looked the same in every direction. If I missed a turn, I'd never know until I was deep into the wrong trail. After several slow miles, I finally saw a clearing. The cabin sat in the middle, low and square, built from dark wood that looked almost black in the cloudy light. The roof was metal, dull and streaked with rust. No other buildings were in sight. The clearing was ringed with trees so dense I couldn't see beyond them. The ground was uneven, scattered with pine needles, fallen branches, and stones. I parked next to the small porch and stepped out. The air smelled like wet earth and sap. It was quiet, no wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just a kind of heavy stillness. My boots crunched on the gravel path to the door. The key was under a flat rock by the steps, just like the directions said. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and something old, maybe from the rugs or the furniture. The place was simple. One main room with a small kitchen in the corner, a wood stove, a table, and a couch facing a single window. Off to the side was a bedroom with a double bed and a small bathroom. The walls were bare except for a clock above the door, the ticking faint but steady. The floor creaked under my weight. I unpacked slowly, putting food in the tiny fridge and my bag in the bedroom. I checked my phone, no signal, not even a single bar. I knew this was coming, but it still made me uneasy. I could still use it for the clock and the flashlight, but there'd be no calling anyone if something happened. That first evening, I made a simple dinner and sat by the window. The clearing looked darker than it should for the time of day, the trees cutting off the last light. I kept catching myself glancing toward the tree line. It felt like the shadows between the trunks were too deep, like they were hiding something. By the time it was fully dark, I realized there were no lights anywhere. No glow from a distant house, no headlights from a road, just pitch black beyond the clearing. I slept fine that night, though the silence was strange. At home, I'm used to faint traffic or neighbors moving around. Here, the only sound was the occasional pop from the cooling metal roof. The second day started quietly. I went for a walk along the dirt road in the morning. I didn't see anyone. No cars passed. No sign that anyone else used the road except for the tire ruts. By midday, I decided to explore behind the cabin. The ground sloped down into a thick patch of woods. The trees here were closer together, their branches tangled high overhead, letting in very little light. About 50 yards in, I found an old trail. It was narrow, with moss-covered stones and fallen limbs across it. It looked unused for years. Still, I followed it for a while until I noticed something strange. About every 100 feet, there were signs that the underbrush had been cleared away, like small patches of ground had been swept clean of leaves. I couldn't tell if it was animals or people. The spots were neat, almost too neat. I turned back before going too far. On my way out, I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. I couldn't hear anything, but something about the silence felt different, like it wasn't empty but waiting. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, just a light, slow crunch on the gravel outside. I lay still, listening. It wasn't the random sound of an animal, it was paced, steady, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. My heart pounded as I strained to hear. Then it stopped. I waited for a long time, eyes fixed on the dark ceiling. Eventually, I told myself it could have been a deer or a raccoon. Still, I didn't get much sleep. On the third day, I noticed something I was sure hadn't been there before. Near the edge of the clearing, in the spot where I had first stepped into the woods, there was a fresh pile of pine needles. It was small, maybe 2 feet across, but it looked arranged, like someone had carefully swept it together. I stood over it for a while, then scattered it with my boot, feeling foolish. That afternoon, clouds rolled in, and the wind picked up. The trees swayed, their branches creaking. The cabin groaned in the gusts. I stayed inside, reading and stoking the fire. That night, the noise came again. This time, it was closer, slow steps on the porch boards. They moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. My mouth went dry. I stayed frozen in bed, barely breathing. After a few minutes, there was the faint sound of something brushing against the wall, a soft drag, like fabric or rope. Then nothing. I barely slept at all. By morning, I decided I needed to check around the cabin in daylight. I walked slowly along the outer walls, scanning the ground. On the far side, near the bedroom wall, I saw clear footprints in the dirt. They weren't boot prints, more like old, worn shoes with almost no tread. The prints led from the tree line to the wall, then back into the trees. They looked fresh. I thought about packing up right then, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a hunter passing through. Still, the nearest house was miles away. The fourth day was cold and gray. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I caught myself scanning the trees. I didn't see movement, but once, I thought I saw a darker shape between 2 pines, gone when I blinked. That night, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the knob. I lay in bed with my flashlight in my hand, listening. Around midnight, the sound came again. Footsteps in the gravel, slow and deliberate. Then a pause. The porch boards creaked. Something brushed against the wall near my head. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. This time, there was a new sound, a faint, metallic clink, like a small tool tapping against the wood. It stopped, then started again in short bursts. I gripped the flashlight tighter but didn't move. After a while, the sounds faded into the distance. In the morning, I checked again. On the bedroom wall, at about waist height, were shallow marks in the wood. Not deep, but fresh, like someone had scraped it with a metal edge. That was the moment I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed quickly, loading my bag into the truck. As I was walking back to the cabin for the last box, I stopped. Near the tree line, right where the footprints had been before, there was another neat pile of pine needles. On top of it sat a small, flat piece of wood, cut into a rough oval with fresh scrape marks along one edge. I didn't touch it. I grabbed the last of my things and left. The dirt road felt longer than before, every turn looking the same. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me. When I finally reached the highway, I didn't stop until I was well out of the area. I called the rental owner later from a gas station, telling them I'd left early because of strange activity around the cabin. They didn't sound surprised. They just said they'd noted it and hung up. I never found out who had been coming to the cabin at night or why they were leaving those piles and scraping the wall. I just know that each night they got closer, and if I had stayed longer, I don't think they would have stopped at the wall. It had been a long time since I'd gone anywhere alone for more than a day, and I wasn't sure why I'd finally decided to book that cabin in the first place. I told myself it was for peace and quiet. I had been feeling run down for months, my head foggy from staring at screens all day, my body heavy from too many late nights. I wanted to hear wind instead of traffic, my boots crunching over dirt instead of sidewalks. The place I rented was small and old. It was tucked deep in the woods of the Upper Peninsula, a couple of hours past the last big town, far from cell service. The online listing had been vague. Just a few grainy photos, a shot of the porch, a small wood stove inside, and a single bed against one wall. The driveway was nothing more than a narrow track cut into the trees, barely wide enough for my car. The drive-in had been the kind that made you second-guess your choices. The paved road had turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to something that was barely a road at all. Rutted, soft in spots, with branches scraping along both sides of the car. The forest pressed in tight, the light dim even though it was only early afternoon. I remember gripping the wheel tighter than I needed to, my jaw sore by the time I finally saw the cabin appear between the trees. It was smaller than I expected. The boards were gray and weathered, the porch sagged slightly at one corner, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. The roof was uneven, and the woodpile stacked beside it looked old, like it had been sitting through more than one winter. There was no other building in sight, no nearby driveway, no sound except for the wind hissing through the pines and a steady tap of something loose on the side of the cabin. I parked close to the porch and got out. The air was colder than I'd thought it would be, with a sharp smell of damp earth and pine needles. My boots sank slightly in the soft ground. I walked around the outside first, my habit whenever I'm in an unfamiliar place. There were no footprints in the dirt around the cabin except for some deer tracks pressed into the mud near the back. The listing had mentioned no running water, just a hand pump out front and an outhouse about 20 feet away, behind a cluster of trees. The pump was rusty, the handle stiff. When I pushed it down, the first spray of water came out brown before clearing. It was cold enough to sting my hands. Inside, the cabin was one room. The wood stove sat in the corner with a bent piece of metal acting as a heat shield behind it. A few shelves along one wall held mismatched mugs and some dusty cans of food. The bed had a thin mattress covered in a wool blanket that smelled faintly of smoke. The floor creaked in places, and there was a trapdoor in the corner with a rusty latch on it. I assumed it led to some sort of crawl space, but I didn't bother checking right then. I set my bag down on the bed and unpacked slowly, listening to the place settle around me. It had that deep wood silence that isn't really silence at all. There's the soft groan of wood shifting, the faint rush of wind outside, the occasional rustle of something moving through the undergrowth. By late afternoon, I had the stove going. The air inside warmed quickly, though the smell of burning dust filled the cabin at first. I sat by the small table near the window, eating a sandwich I'd packed. My plan had been simple. Read, maybe hike a little, sleep early. The first thing that felt off happened just before dusk. I was outside splitting some of the older logs from the woodpile when I heard it. A single sharp crack from deeper in the woods. It wasn't the sound of a branch falling naturally. It was quick, deliberate. I stopped and listened, the wedge still in my hand. The forest went still in that way it does when something has just happened. After a few seconds, the normal sounds returned. The wind, a distant call of some bird. I went inside as the light started to fade. The cabin didn't have electricity, so I lit one of the oil lamps from the shelf. The glass was streaked and cloudy, but it gave off enough light to keep the shadows from pressing in too much. I sat by the stove and read, though my attention wandered often to the window. That night, I woke to a faint noise. It was the kind that doesn't immediately register because it blends with other sounds, wind, shifting wood. But it was there. I lay still, listening. It came again, softer than before. A footstep. At least it sounded like one. Not the quick patter of an animal. Heavier. I told myself it was just the cabin settling, or maybe a raccoon on the porch. Still, I got up quietly and moved toward the window. The oil lamp was turned low, and the glass reflected most of the light, making it hard to see outside. I cupped my hands around my face and leaned close. The porch was empty. The trees beyond were just dark shapes in the faint moonlight. I stood there for a while, until my eyes ached from staring into the darkness. Finally, I went back to bed. It took a long time to fall asleep. The next day, I went for a short hike, sticking to the dirt track I'd driven in on. The forest was dense, the ground covered in a thick mat of needles and damp leaves. In some spots, fallen logs forced me to climb over or detour. The quiet was deep here. No distant cars, no hum of power lines. Just the wind and the occasional flutter of wings. About a mile from the cabin, I noticed something strange. Off to the side of the track, maybe 20 feet in, was a large, recently cut tree stump. The saw marks were fresh, and the wood still smelled of sap. But there were no signs of the tree itself. No branches, no trunk lying nearby. Just the stump. The ground around it was disturbed, as if something heavy had been dragged away. It stuck in my mind as I walked back. That evening, as I was making a small meal on the stove, I heard the sound again. Something moving outside. Not close to the porch this time, but circling the cabin. Slow, steady. The hair on my arms rose. I stayed very still, listening. It moved in short bursts, 3 or 4 steps, then silence. Then again, always just far enough away that I couldn't see anything from the window. When it stopped completely, I realized I'd been holding my breath. I kept expecting it to start again, but it didn't. The third night was the worst. I had gone to bed early, but the sound woke me again. Only this time, it wasn't just footsteps. There was a long, slow scrape against the side of the cabin. Then a pause. Then another scrape lower down, like something dragging across the boards. I didn't move. My eyes were wide open in the dark, my ears straining. The scraping continued, now on a different wall. At some point, I heard a faint thud from the direction of the porch. Not loud, but enough to know it wasn't a squirrel or raccoon. It was heavier. The thought of looking out the window made my skin crawl. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, until the sounds finally stopped. The next morning, I found tracks in the soft ground near the back of the cabin. They were boot prints, large, fresh. I stayed only one more night. By then, the noises had changed. Less cautious, more direct. Something brushed against the walls twice, hard enough to make the boards flex. I could hear the wood creak under weight on the porch. I sat at the table with the oil lamp burning low, my jacket on, my bag packed beside me. When dawn finally came, I carried my bag to the car, my eyes on the tree line. The forest was still, too still. The drive out felt longer than the drive in. Every turn in the road, every stretch where the trees closed in tight, made me feel trapped. When I reached the gravel road again, I didn't look back. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. But I know this, someone had been out there in those woods, watching. They had walked right up to the cabin more than once, and they weren't afraid of being heard. I haven't gone back to a cabin since. I had been looking forward to that week for months. The plan was simple: 7 days in the mountains, in a small cabin I had rented from a guy who posted it online. It wasn't through a big website, just one of those old-style classified ads. I wanted something private, quiet, away from people. I'd been working 60-hour weeks for nearly a year straight, and I felt like my brain was burning out. The thought of waking up to the sound of wind in the trees instead of car horns or phone notifications sounded like heaven. The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from my home, deep in the forested part of the northern mountains. It wasn't fancy, at least. From the photos, it looked like a basic wooden structure with a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a wood stove for heat. The guy said it was off-grid, meaning no Wi-Fi and spotty cell service. That didn't bother me. In fact, it was part of the reason I wanted it. No one would be able to call me for work. I could finally shut out the world. I packed light enough food for the week: a small camping stove in case the wood stove didn't work, a flashlight, extra batteries, a good knife, my hiking boots, and some books I'd been meaning to read. I also brought a small cooler with ice packs for perishable food and a solar charger for my phone, just in case I needed it for emergencies. The drive up was long but beautiful. The road narrowed the farther I went, winding between tall pines and steep rocky slopes. The last stretch was a dirt road that snaked uphill for nearly half an hour. I passed no other cars. The air was cool and clean, and the sky was so clear that even during the day you could almost see the faint traces of the moon. The cabin sat at the end of that dirt road, backed against a dense wall of forest. It was even smaller than I expected, with faded brown paint and a tin roof that looked a bit rusted. A narrow porch stretched across the front, with 2 old wooden chairs. The windows were small, with plain curtains drawn inside. To the left of the cabin was a shed, its padlock hanging loose. Behind it, the forest rose steeply up the slope of a hill. The place felt quiet, too quiet. Even though it was the middle of the day, there was no birdsong, no rustling of small animals, just the wind moving through the tops of the trees. Inside, the cabin was basic but tidy. A small table with 2 chairs, a compact counter with a propane stove, a few shelves of dishes, and the wood stove in the corner. The bedroom was just big enough for a double bed and a dresser. The mattress sagged a little, but I'd brought my own bedding. There was a small bathroom with a composting toilet and a hand pump sink. I unpacked, opened some windows to let in fresh air, and took a slow walk around the place. The shed was empty except for an old axe, some logs, and a coil of rope. I made a mental note of the rope. It looked sturdy enough that it could be useful. That first night was peaceful. I lit the wood stove, made pasta, and ate while the wind rattled gently at the windows. When darkness came, it was complete. No lights anywhere, not even the faint glow of a distant town. Just blackness pressing against the windows. It was strange, but calming in a way. I went to bed early and slept deeply. The next morning, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. I brought a backpack with water, snacks, a map, and my compass. The trees here were old, thick-trunked pines and spruce, with fallen needles carpeting the ground. The land sloped in odd ways, gentle in some places, steep in others, with clusters of boulders half hidden under moss. I hiked for a couple of hours before circling back, making sure I didn't go too far since I wasn't familiar with the terrain yet. By the 3rd day, I was fully settled in. I had a rhythm: wake up with the sunrise, make breakfast, take a hike, spend the afternoon reading or chopping wood, cook dinner, and watch the sky darken. It was exactly the quiet escape I'd wanted. But on the 4th night, something changed. I was lying in bed, reading by flashlight, when I heard a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just wind, but then I realized it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the porch. My stomach tightened, I turned off the flashlight and listened. The footsteps stopped, then started again, 1, 2, 3 steps. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. After maybe a minute, I heard a faint creak, like the wood of the porch shifting under weight. I told myself it could be an animal, a deer maybe, but something about the rhythm of those steps felt wrong. Too even, too human. I stayed in bed, straining to hear. After a while, the sound stopped completely. I didn't dare get up to check. Eventually, I fell asleep, though it was a restless kind of sleep, full of half-dreams. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch to look. The dirt in front of the steps was disturbed, not animal tracks, but what looked like the faint impressions of boot soles. They weren't sharp enough to be certain, but they were too big and too deep to be from me. I'd been wearing hiking shoes, not heavy boots. I spent that day a little on edge. I kept glancing toward the trees, scanning the shadows. Nothing moved. By afternoon, I tried to shake it off. Maybe a lost hiker had wandered through. Maybe they saw the cabin and left. But that night, it happened again. It was later this time, maybe past midnight, when I woke to the sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. A soft scrape like fabric against wood. Then those same slow, heavy footsteps on the porch. This time they went right up to the front door. I could hear the faint click of the door handle moving, testing. The lock held, but my skin prickled all over. Whoever it was, they were trying to get in. I stayed completely still, every muscle tense. The handle stopped moving, and the footsteps retreated. I heard them descend the steps and crunch softly through the dirt. Then nothing. I didn't sleep at all after that. When the sun finally came up, I checked the porch again. This time, the boot prints were clearer. Large, heavy, treaded. Definitely not mine. That day, I decided I wasn't going to hike far. I kept my pack ready with essentials in case I needed to leave quickly. The cabin's lock was small and flimsy, and there was no phone signal. If something happened, I'd be on my own. That night, I stayed up with the lights off, listening. Hours passed in silence. Then, sometime after 2 in the morning, I heard it again, the faint crunch of footsteps, but this time not on the porch. They were circling the cabin. Slow, measured. I imagined someone moving just beyond the windows, peering in from the darkness. I gripped the knife I'd kept on the nightstand. The footsteps stopped directly outside the bedroom wall. Then I heard the faintest sound, breathing. Not mine. Deep, steady, close. I froze, every muscle locked. After what felt like forever, the breathing faded, replaced by soft, retreating steps. Eventually, there was nothing but the wind again. I didn't know if they'd be back the next night. I didn't want to find out. At dawn, I packed everything fast, shoving food and clothes into my backpack. I decided to hike out to where the dirt road met the main road. It would be a long walk, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying another night. As I stepped off the porch, I froze. There, stuck between the boards of the top step, was a strip of fabric, dark green, like from a jacket. And on the railing, faint but unmistakable, were the marks of fingers gripping the wood. Whoever it was had been leaning there, watching. I didn't take another look. I headed straight for the road and didn't stop moving until I was far from that cabin. Even now, I don't know who it was or what they wanted. But the thought that they knew exactly where I was sleeping, in a locked cabin miles from anyone else, still keeps me up some nights. I had been wanting a quiet place to stay for months. I'd been working too much, staying late at the office most nights, barely eating anything except takeout. My head felt constantly heavy, and my chest always seemed tight. I needed to get away from people, from the city noise, and from the endless cycle of screens and phone calls. I found the cabin online. It was listed on a small, outdated rental site. The photos were grainy, probably taken years ago. The description said it sat by Dry Creek Bend, a remote area about 20 miles from the nearest town. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and only a dirt road leading in. The listing claimed it was fully stocked with firewood, and the nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. That sounded perfect. I booked it for 5 days. The drive out took longer than I expected. The last 10 miles were on a winding dirt track that narrowed the farther I went. My tires kicked up dust so thick it hung in the air like smoke, and I had to slow to almost a crawl in some stretches where deep ruts cut across the road. The forest was dense here, tall pines and dark green spruce, branches tangled high overhead. The sun was still up when I arrived, but under the trees it already felt like dusk. The cabin looked old but sturdy. It was built from weathered logs with a wide porch facing the creek. The roof was metal, spotted with rust, and the windows were small. There was a shed off to the side, its door hanging slightly crooked. Behind the cabin, the slope rose sharply into the forest. The creek, maybe 20 feet across, ran slowly past the front, the water low and brown from the dry summer. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The living space was small, with a stone fireplace against one wall and a threadbare couch facing it. A small kitchen area stood at the back with an old propane stove, a chipped sink, and shelves stocked with mismatched mugs and plates. The bedroom was just big enough for a bed and a dresser, and the bathroom was cramped, with a water heater that looked decades old. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to set things where I wanted them. I filled a metal kettle from the sink and set it on the stove. As the water heated, I stepped out onto the porch. The air was cooler now, and I could hear the faint trickle of the creek mixed with the occasional rustle from the trees. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. That first night was quiet. I read until the light faded, then lit a fire. The dry logs caught quickly, the orange glow filling the room. I remember thinking that I could easily fall asleep there on the couch, the warmth making my eyelids heavy. At some point, I did. I woke to the sound of the fire popping, the room dark except for the low embers, and stumbled into the bedroom. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. I followed the creek upstream, stepping over stones slick with moss. I found a narrow trail that climbed the slope behind the cabin. It wasn't well worn. In places, I had to push branches aside or step over fallen logs. The forest grew darker as I went, the ground covered in thick layers of pine needles. After about an hour, I turned back. I hadn't brought water, and the air felt warmer than I'd expected. That evening, I noticed something strange. As I was stacking more wood by the fireplace, I saw marks in the dirt just off the porch. They weren't shoe prints exactly, but they were wide and uneven, as if something heavy had pressed into the ground. At first, I thought maybe it was just where I had stepped earlier, but the spacing was wrong. Too far apart for my stride and deeper. I told myself it was probably from an animal. The third day, I woke earlier than usual. The sunlight through the small window was bright, but the air felt heavy, almost like before a storm. I decided to take the dirt road back toward town to pick up more supplies, even though I had enough food. The thought of the cabin being so isolated had started to feel different. At first it was peaceful, but now there was a sharp edge to it, the kind you don't notice until it's already under your skin. The road out seemed longer than it had coming in. The turns felt sharper, the trees closer to the edges of the track. I bought some canned food, more water, and a few extra batteries for my flashlight. On the way back, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting another car, but I didn't see a single one. That night, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, just a light, slow crunch in the dirt near the porch. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound stopped for a moment, then came again, moving toward the side of the cabin. I stayed still, breathing quietly. My first thought was deer, maybe raccoons, but then there was a soft, deliberate scrape against the wall. Not claws, not hooves, something else. I got up and went to the living room, standing in the dark. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want to make my presence obvious. I listened, but the sound didn't come again. When I finally opened the front door, the porch was empty. The marks in the dirt from the day before seemed fresher, the edges sharper. The next morning, I walked around the cabin carefully. Behind it, near the slope, I found more of those uneven impressions in the ground. They weren't deep enough to be from a bear, and they weren't shaped like human shoes either. They were just wrong. Too long in some places, too narrow in others, and uneven in depth, like something unbalanced had been moving through. The fourth night was the worst. I had been reading again, trying to ignore the feeling that the woods were too quiet. The fire had burned low, and I was about to add more wood when I heard the sound, this time on the porch itself. A slow, heavy step, then another. The boards creaked under the weight. My heart started pounding. I didn't move. The steps came closer to the door, then stopped. I waited, every muscle tense, the air in my chest feeling like it wouldn't go in all the way. The quiet stretched out. Then came the scrape again, this time against the door. A long, slow drag of something solid along the wood. I reached for the fireplace poker without thinking, my hands shaking. The scrape stopped. A few seconds later, the steps moved away, slow and uneven, fading into the dirt. When morning came, I checked the porch. There were marks on the door, low and jagged, as if something had pressed against it. The dirt at the bottom of the steps was disturbed again. I didn't pack right then, but I thought about it all day. The final night, I stayed awake, sitting in the dark with the poker beside me. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of dirt, the uneven steps. This time, they circled the cabin. Once, twice, 3 times. Then nothing. I didn't sleep. As soon as the sun rose, I packed everything into my car. The air outside was cool, but my shirt was damp with sweat. I didn't take one last look at the cabin. I didn't check the dirt for more marks. I just got in and drove. When I reached the paved road miles later, I felt the tension in my chest loosen for the first time in days. I never went back. I never found out what had been walking there at night, and I don't want to. I never planned on spending that week alone in the cabin. The original idea was for my brother to join me for some quiet time in the woods after a long year. But 2 days before we were set to leave, he called to say work had called him back. I could have canceled, but I'd already booked the place, and I figured I might as well go. At worst, I get a week of fresh air, quiet nights, and a chance to reset my mind away from the constant noise of the city. The cabin was at Wren Lake, about 3.5 hours north of the nearest big town. The last 30 miles were along a gravel road that wound through thick pine forests, then narrowed to a dirt track. No cell service out there, which I already knew. The rental ad had mentioned that, almost as a selling point, * disconnect and unwind in total seclusion star. The road ended in a clearing just big enough for a single vehicle. The cabin itself was tucked against the edge of the trees, about 50 yards from the shoreline. It was a simple rectangular structure, wood-paneled, with a pitched roof and a porch that wrapped around the front. A single chimney poked up from one side. The lake stretched out beyond the porch, smooth and dark under an overcast sky. I unloaded my gear, 2 duffel bags, a box of groceries, and a plastic bin with extra supplies, then went inside. The air smelled faintly of pine and old wood. The main room was one big space, a couch and a coffee table on one side, a small dining table near the kitchen area on the other. The wood stove sat in the corner, black metal with a short stack of chopped logs beside it. A narrow hallway led to a small bedroom and a bathroom. There was a kind of stillness there that felt different from the city's silence. Out here, the quiet had weight. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of everything else. Trees holding their breath, the faint ripple of water on the shore, the creak of the cabin's boards settling. I unpacked slowly, setting my food in the small fridge and stacking canned goods in the cupboard. I placed my flashlight on the table, laid out my sleeping bag on the bed, and checked the windows. The locks worked, though the wood frames were old. The back window had a small crack in the corner of the glass. The first night passed without much to note. I lit a fire in the wood stove, cooked pasta, and read by lantern light. When I finally turned in, the darkness outside was so complete that I couldn't see the trees beyond the porch. Only the faint slap of water against the shore and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the forest broke the quiet. On the second day, I decided to explore the shoreline. The lake was bigger than I'd realized, stretching in both directions until it curved out of sight. The water was dark and cold, the bottom dropping off sharply only a few feet from shore. Across the lake, The opposite bank was thick with trees and unbroken by any signs of human presence. It was maybe mid-afternoon when I noticed something odd in the sand near the tree-line. Footprints. At first, I assumed they were mine from the day before, but these were different, larger, deeper. Whoever made them was wearing heavy boots, and they came from the forest, stopping just short of the waterline before turning back into the trees. I followed them a few yards into the woods, but they disappeared quickly among the pine needles and undergrowth. It didn't seem like much at the time. I told myself it was probably from some fisherman or hiker who'd come through recently. Still, that night, I found myself glancing out the window more than once. On the third night, I woke to a sound. Not loud, but sharp enough to pull me from sleep. It was like the crunch of gravel or dry leaves under weight. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but it came again, slower this time, like careful steps. I stayed still, my eyes open in the dark, listening. The sound stopped. Then there was another noise, light but distinct. A creak. The porch boards. I slid out of bed quietly and moved toward the main room. I kept the lights off and looked out through the side window. The moon was behind clouds, so I could barely make out shapes. The porch was a dim outline, the railing a darker line against the sky. I didn't see anyone, but I had that uncomfortable sense of being watched. After maybe 5 minutes of silence, I convinced myself it had been nothing. Old wood shifted. Animals moved around. I went back to bed but didn't sleep much. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. In the damp earth just beyond the porch steps, I saw it. A single boot print, deep and crisp, too large to be mine. The edges were sharp enough to tell it was fresh. Something in me shifted then. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a slow tightening in my gut. I decided to keep my eyes open and be cautious. That day I kept busy, stacking more wood inside and making sure my flashlight and lantern were working. I checked my food and water supplies. I still had several days left and didn't want to cut the trip short unless I had to. The fourth night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed, listening for every sound. The cabin made small noises, wood expanding and contracting, the stove clicking as it cooled. But around midnight, I heard movement again. Not on the porch this time. This was softer, more deliberate, from the direction of the back wall. It was the sound of someone walking slowly in the grass and dirt outside, circling. I stayed still, counting the steps in my head. They paused near the bedroom window. I imagined someone standing there, looking in. The crack in the glass suddenly felt like a weak point. The footsteps moved away after a while, fading into the trees. I waited another 30 minutes before I let myself breathe normally again. The next morning, I found more prints, 2 sets this time. One set approached from the forest, came close to the cabin, then left. The other looped around to the side before disappearing toward the lake. That was when I decided I wasn't going to wait for things to escalate. I began packing, methodically but quickly. I loaded my bags into the car, double-checked the interior of the cabin to make sure I left nothing behind, and locked the door. The drive out was tense. Every bend in the dirt road felt like a place where someone could be standing. The trees pressed in close, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. When I finally hit the gravel road and later the highway, the tension didn't fully leave me. It wasn't until I was back in cell service range that I realized how isolated I had been. No one knew exactly where I was, and whoever had been around the cabin could have done anything without being seen. That night, in my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about the prints. They'd been deliberate. Someone had come more than once, moving closer each time. I never went back to Wren Lake. I had been needing a break from everything for months. Work had been nothing but endless deadlines, and the city felt like it was pressing down on me from all directions. I wanted somewhere quiet, far from traffic, far from people, far from the constant hum that never seems to stop in urban life. That was why I booked a small rental cabin tucked away in the lower part of a valley, surrounded by forest and backed by a ridge of steep rock. The place was remote. No neighbors, no cell service, no paved roads for miles. You got there by driving down a narrow dirt trail that wound through tall pine and fir trees until you reached a small clearing. The cabin itself was simple. A single floor, wooden siding weathered gray by years of rain and wind, a slanted tin roof that would rattle in the wind. There was a front porch with a single chair, a tiny woodpile stacked unevenly beside the door, and 2 small windows on the front wall. When I unlocked the door that first afternoon, the air inside had that closed-up smell, a mixture of dust, dried wood, and something faintly metallic. Inside, it was just one big room with a corner kitchen, a bed against the wall, a wood stove near the center, and a small table under one of the windows. The back door led to a deck overlooking the slope down into the valley floor, where a narrow creek wound between stones. The view was the kind of quiet I'd been looking for, just trees, rocks, and the sound of water somewhere below. The first day passed without incident. I unpacked, swept some dust out of the corners, chopped a bit of wood for the stove, and sat on the porch until the sun began to fade behind the ridge. The air cooled fast once the light was gone, so I lit the stove. The orange glow and the crackle of the fire filled the small space with a warmth that made me almost forget how far away from anyone I was. Almost. That night, the quiet felt heavier. I'd never realized before how absolute the silence in a remote forest can be after dark. There was no distant hum of traffic, no muffled voices from nearby apartments, no streetlights filtering in through blinds, just the creak of the cabin settling, the occasional crack of the stove wood, and my own breathing. When I went to bed, I found myself straining to hear something, anything, just to remind me I wasn't the only living thing in miles. The second day, I explored the valley. I followed the creek downstream, hopping between rocks and stepping through shallow pools. I saw animal tracks in the mud, deer, raccoon, something else I couldn't quite place. The forest was thick, the ground covered in pine needles, the air sharp with the smell of damp earth and resin. I climbed back up to the cabin in the afternoon, sweaty but refreshed. That evening, clouds rolled in. I could hear distant thunder far up the valley. By the time I was eating, rain had started to fall steadily. It wasn't heavy, but it was constant, a soft patter on the tin roof. The sound was oddly comforting at first, but as night came, the rain mixed with wind. Branches tapped against the cabin siding. Every so often there would be a louder thud as something, maybe a pine cone or loose branch, hit the roof. At around midnight, I woke up. The stove had gone cold, and the room was chilly. At first, I thought the sound that woke me was just the wind, but after a few seconds, I realized it wasn't. There was a slow, irregular crunching noise outside. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps, too heavy, too spaced out. They sounded like someone walking carefully, trying not to make noise but still stepping on gravel and twigs. I stayed completely still, my eyes open in the dark, straining to hear more. The steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other. I pictured the small clearing around me, porch in the front, slope behind, trees all around. Whoever it was, they were circling. There was no lock on the back door, only a simple latch. My heartbeat picked up hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I thought about grabbing the hatchet I'd used earlier, but it was out on the porch by the woodpile. I decided not to move. The steps faded after a while, replaced by just the wind and rain. I told myself it was probably an animal after all. Maybe a deer. Maybe my brain was just twisting normal sounds into something threatening because I was alone. Still, I barely slept the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked around outside. The ground was muddy from the rain. I saw boot prints, not fresh enough to show sharp edges, but clear enough that I knew they weren't mine. They were larger, the tread different. They went from the edge of the clearing, around the cabin, and disappeared back into the trees. I spent the day trying to convince myself it was just a hunter passing through. The valley was remote, sure, but not impossible to reach. Maybe someone had been scouting or looking for a trail. Still, I kept glancing toward the tree line while I chopped more wood, and I shut the curtains that night before lighting the stove. The wind picked up again after dark, and I forced myself to read until I was too tired to think about anything. But sometime deep into the night, I woke again. The stove was still glowing faintly, and the sound that had pulled me from sleep was different this time. It was a faint scraping, like something metal brushing wood. I realized after a few seconds it was the sound of the back door latch being tested. I stayed in bed, breathing as quietly as I could, listening. The latch clicked once, twice, then silence. No footsteps retreating this time, no crunch of leaves. Just silence so deep that every second felt stretched too long. I didn't move until I saw the first light of dawn leaking through the curtain. When I checked the back door, there was a single muddy smear on the wood, right near the latch. No boot prints this time. Whoever it was had been close enough to touch the door. That was when my unease shifted into something sharper. I decided to keep the hatchet inside from then on. I propped it against the wall by my bed. I didn't think about packing up and leaving just yet. I told myself that whoever it was probably realized the cabin was occupied and would move on. But deep down, I knew that wasn't how things usually went. The third night, I barely slept. I stayed awake long enough to hear nothing for hours, then dozed off, then woke again with the feeling that something wasn't right. The air in the cabin felt different, colder, heavier. My eyes adjusted enough to make out the faint outline of the front window. The curtains I had drawn were open a few inches. I hadn't opened them. I lay there staring at that gap, my skin prickling, waiting for movement. I didn't see anything, but when I checked in the morning, there was a faint impression in the dirt just under the window, the kind you might make if you stood still for a long time. By then, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone was coming back each night, getting closer each time. I drove out of town early in the morning, the kind of morning where the air feels heavy and cool, and the light is soft enough to make the trees look like shadows against the pale sky. The road was empty for long stretches, and the further I went, the fewer houses I saw. The asphalt wound through thick forest, with the occasional break where I could see rolling hills or a strip of the lake in the distance. I had rented the cabin for a week. I told myself I needed the quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when there are no neighbors for miles, no streetlights, no hum of traffic. The listing had shown a weathered wooden cabin right on the edge of Lake Raven, an old logging road leading to it, and nothing else nearby. It seemed perfect. The turnoff was easy to miss. It was a dirt track, narrow and rutted, marked only by a faded wooden sign with no words, just a carved arrow. I slowed the car, the tires crunching over gravel and loose stones. The trees leaned in from both sides, their branches creating a tunnel of green. Sunlight filtered through in broken patches, blinking across the windshield. It took nearly 15 minutes down that track before I saw the cabin. It sat on a small rise above the water, the lake stretching out behind it in a flat silver sheet. The building was small, a single story with a pitched roof and a porch running along the front. The wood was darkened from age, and the porch boards sagged slightly in the middle. Off to one side was a narrow dock, extending into the water. The place looked exactly like it had in the photos, only quieter, older, like it had been waiting a long time for someone to show up. I parked beside it, stepping out into the stillness. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, with a faint trace of fish from the lake. I stood for a moment just listening. No cars, no voices, only the slow lapping of water against the dock and the distant cry of a bird I couldn't see. Inside, the cabin was plain but clean. One main room held a small kitchen, a table, and a couch facing an old wood stove. There was a single bedroom at the back, with a narrow bed and a window looking out toward the trees. The boards creaked under my steps, and the air inside had that faint mustiness of a place left closed for too long. I opened a few windows to let in the fresh air. I spent the first day unpacking, sweeping off the porch, and walking down to the dock to test the water. It was colder than I expected, but clear enough to see smooth stones on the bottom. The shore curved away on both sides, and in either direction, the trees came right down to the water. No boats passed. No people appeared on the opposite shore. By evening, I had made a small fire in the stove. The light outside faded quickly, the sun dropping behind the trees. The lake turned from silver to black, the sky deepening to the color of ink. The cabin grew quiet in a way that felt heavier than it had during the day. I could hear the faint ticking of cooling metal from the stove, the occasional groan of wood settling. I lay in bed, listening to the small sounds, and eventually drifted off. The second day, I explored further. I followed the shoreline to the right, pushing through undergrowth and stepping over fallen branches. The ground was soft with layers of needles and leaves. I saw animal tracks in the mud, deer, maybe raccoon. The air felt cooler under the dense canopy, and every so often I'd catch a sound from deeper in the forest. A branch snapping, a rustle of movement. I never saw what made them. By midday, I had circled far enough that the cabin was out of sight. The shoreline curved around a small bay, and I could see the remains of an old dock, half collapsed into the water. Something about the way it tilted, abandoned, made me uneasy. I turned back, keeping a steady pace until the cabin came into view again. That night, I noticed the first odd sound. It was late, past midnight I guessed, when I woke suddenly, unsure why. The cabin was dark, except for the faint glow from the stove's embers. I stayed still, listening. Outside, I heard the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on gravel. The sound came from the side of the cabin, near where my car was parked. The steps were spaced apart, like someone was walking carefully, not in a hurry. I waited, holding my breath. The sound moved toward the porch, the boards creaking under weight. Then silence. I lay there for what felt like an hour, straining to hear, but there was nothing else. Eventually, I told myself it could have been an animal. Out here, deer were common, maybe even black bear. Still, I didn't sleep well after that. The following day was windier. The lake surface rippled and shifted, and the trees made a low, constant hiss. I stayed near the cabin, splitting some firewood and keeping the stove going. Every so often, I'd glance at the tree lean. The night before kept replaying in my head. That evening, I set a chair on the porch, watching the lake until the light faded. The wind dropped after dark, and the stillness returned. I went inside, checked that the door was bolted, and tried to sleep. Sometime in the early hours, the sound came again. Footsteps on gravel. My eyes opened instantly. They stopped briefly, then the porch boards creaked. This time, I heard a faint metallic sound, like something brushing against the door handle. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The sound paused, then faded slowly away toward the dock. To first light, I went outside. The ground near the porch had faint impressions. Shapes too large to be from a deer, too narrow to be from a bear. Human. The dock was empty, but I noticed small stones scattered across it, as if someone had kicked them loose while walking. The days began to blend together. Each night, I heard the same sounds. Slow footsteps, the creak of the porch. Sometimes they stopped near the door, sometimes near the windows. I never saw anyone. The forest was too dense to see far, and the lake too wide to notice movement on the far shore. By the fifth night, I was sleeping less than a few hours at a time. My nerves were sharp, and every creak of the cabin made me tense. I started keeping a heavy piece of firewood beside the bed, the closest thing to a weapon I had. That night, the sounds came earlier. The footsteps were heavier, less careful. They stopped directly outside the bedroom window. I could hear slow breathing, close enough that the glass faintly rattled when it exhaled. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark outline of the window. Then, without warning, the sound moved quickly toward the front door, the boards on the porch groaning. There was a low scraping noise, like metal against wood. I didn't sleep after that. At dawn, I packed my bag. I decided to leave even though my rental wasn't over. When I stepped outside, the air was cold and still. The ground around the cabin had more prints than before, all leading from the tree lean to the porch, circling it, then heading toward the dock. As I loaded the car, I saw something under the edge of the porch, half buried in the dirt. I crouched and pulled it free. It was a worn leather glove, damp from the ground, the fingertips frayed. It was sized for a man's hand. I didn't look back at the cabin as I drove away. The trees closed in around the road again, hiding it from view. The sound of gravel under the tires faded, replaced by the steady hum of pavement once I reached the highway. When I finally reached town, I stopped at a gas station. The smell of fuel, the sound of traffic, even the glare of fluorescent lights felt like a relief. I realized my hands were still shaking slightly. I never reported it. I told myself it was probably just someone passing through, maybe a fisherman, maybe a hunter. But I knew that whoever it was had been there for several nights in a row, watching. I never went back to Lake Raven. I never even looked at the listing again. And sometimes, even now, when I wake in the middle of the night, I think I hear that slow, careful crunch of footsteps in the gravel, coming closer. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, the sky already dim under thick winter clouds. Snow covered everything, the trees heavy with it, and the driveway looked like it hadn't been used in days. I had to push the truck harder than I liked to get up the final slope, the tires spinning before finally gripping enough to make it to the top. The place was small, built from old logs that had darkened over the years, with a metal roof now half covered by snow. The air felt colder here than it had in town, even though it wasn't that far away. I could hear almost nothing but the soft crunch of my boots in the snow as I carried in my bags. The cabin's door was stubborn, the wood slightly warped from age, but after a shove it opened into a room that smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. The stove in the corner was cold, and the air inside was sharp enough that my breath showed in front of me. The plan was simple: 3 days away from everything. No work emails, no noise from neighbors, no city traffic. I had firewood stacked outside, enough food in the truck, and no reason to leave until I was ready. It was supposed to be peaceful. The first hour was just me bringing in supplies, stacking them near the small kitchen counter, and getting the wood stove going. The crackle of kindling catching was comforting, and the room slowly started to warm. I lit a few oil lamps even though there was electricity, partly because the soft light felt better than the buzzing overhead bulb. By the time I had the place set up, the snow outside had started again. It wasn't heavy, just steady, drifting flakes, but it came with a wind that made the trees sway. The sound was a low moan as it pushed through the woods. That first night, nothing felt wrong. I read a little, cooked something simple, and turned in early. The bed in the loft was piled with heavy blankets, and the sound of the wind outside was almost soothing. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The stove burned low. My breath was fogging again, and the first thing I did was climb down to get it going before the cold settled too deep into the cabin. I stepped outside briefly to grab more wood and saw a single set of footprints in the fresh snow leading away from the cabin. They weren't mine. The tread was different, smaller, and there was only one direction, away toward the tree line. I stood there for a long moment, the cold air making my fingers numb. It was early enough that no one should have been around. The driveway was untouched except for my tire marks. The prints hadn't been blown over yet, so they had to be recent, maybe even from before dawn. I followed them only to the edge of the trees. Beyond that, the forest swallowed them up. The snow was deeper there, and I couldn't see far. I told myself it could have been a hiker, maybe someone passing through, though it was bitterly cold and the nearest trail wasn't close. The day passed quietly enough, but I kept thinking about those prints. Every time I went outside for wood or to stretch my legs, my eyes drifted to the tree line. That night, I heard something. It was faint at first, a crunch in the snow, like someone stepping carefully. I sat still in the loft, listening, telling myself it could be an animal. The sound stopped for a while, then started again, closer to the cabin this time. I couldn't see out from where I was without moving to the small window. When I finally did, the only thing visible was the faint outline of the trees against the snow, swaying in the wind. I stayed up late, waiting for the noise again, but it didn't return. The third day started with a heavier snowfall. Visibility was poor, and the woods were blurred behind a white curtain. I decided to split some wood outside while it was light, just to keep busy. The air was still, the kind of muffled silence you only get when snow is falling thick. Then I saw it, on the far side of the clearing, near the trees, a figure. It wasn't close enough to see details, just a shape, still upright. The snow drifted around it, and for a second I thought it might be a dead tree I'd never noticed. But as I stood there, axe in hand, the shape moved, just a shift, like it had turned slightly. I went back inside without finishing the wood. My pulse was up, and I kept glancing at the window. When I finally looked again, the figure was gone. The rest of the day I stayed inside, the stove going hot, the lamps burning early. I thought about packing up, but the snow was getting deep, and I didn't want to risk the truck on that steep driveway while it was slick. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I woke to a noise, slow, deliberate steps on the porch. Not the scurrying of an animal, but the weight of boots. I lay still, every sound in the cabin suddenly too loud. The tick of the stove, my own breathing. The steps stopped right outside the door. Then there was nothing. No knock, no movement, just silence. I stayed awake until dawn, the fire low but not daring to leave the loft. When daylight came, I went to the door. There were fresh footprints on the porch, the same tread as before, leading down the steps and disappearing into the woods. I didn't waste time. I loaded the truck, made sure everything was locked, and headed down the driveway slow. The snow had stopped, but the sky was still heavy. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following, but the road behind me stayed empty. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't look back. The cabin shrank in my memory even as I drove, the weight of it lingering like the cold in my bones. It wasn't until I got home that I let myself think clearly about it. Someone had been there. Someone had come to the cabin in the middle of the night, stood outside, and left without a word. I'll never know if they were just watching or if they'd planned something worse, but I know I won't go back there again. It was the middle of February when I decided to take a trip to the mountains. I had been working long hours for months, and I wanted somewhere quiet, away from the constant noise and rush of the city. I booked a small cabin online, one that sat far up a narrow gravel road in the woods. From the photos, it looked old but well kept, with a single floor, a front porch, and a wood stove inside. It was about 2 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by tall pines and a few patches of open ground that the snow had already covered. I left home before sunrise so I could get there in daylight. The drive was long, but the roads were clear until I turned off onto the gravel road leading to the cabin. The snow here was packed down into icy ruts. The trees grew so close to the road that their branches scraped my truck's roof as I drove. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, and the cold air stung my face when I stepped out. The quiet was so heavy that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The cabin door opened with a creak, and the smell of old would hit me immediately. It was warmer than I expected inside, probably from the sunlight through the small windows. The place was simple. 1 bedroom, a small bathroom, a kitchen area, and a living room with a wood stove in the center. There was no TV, no internet, and barely any cell signal. I dropped my bags on the couch and walked around to get a feel for the place. The floorboards groaned with every step. The first night was calm. I lit a fire in the stove, cooked a small meal, and sat in a chair with a book. The wind outside picked up after dark, and the sound of it moving through the trees made the place feel even more remote. Every once in a while, I heard small cracks from the walls as the wood adjusted to the cold. I wasn't nervous, just aware of how alone I was. When I finally went to bed, I left the fire going low so the cabin wouldn't freeze overnight. I woke up early the next morning to a pale gray light coming through the curtains. The air felt colder. When I stepped outside, I saw that it had snowed several inches overnight. My truck was half covered, and the narrow road I had driven up yesterday was now buried. I wasn't too worried. My trip was supposed to last 4 days, and I had plenty of food and firewood. I spent the day exploring the woods nearby, following the edge of a frozen creek for a while. The snow was deep in some spots, and I could hear the muffled sound of my boots crunching with each step. That evening, as I was cutting more wood outside, I noticed something strange. Near the tree line, maybe 30 yards away, there was a single set of footprints in the snow. They were spaced out like someone walking, not an animal. What caught my attention was that they came from deeper in the forest and stopped at the edge of the clearing. There were no return prints, I stood there for a while, scanning the trees, but there was no movement and no sound. The light was fading, so I went back inside and locked the door. That night, I kept thinking about the footprints. Could have been a hunter, maybe someone passing through, but it bothered me that they didn't go back the way they came. I told myself the wind might have covered the return trail. The sound of the stove and the crackle of burning logs filled the cabin, but every time there was silence between the pops, I found myself listening for something outside. The third day, the cold deepened. The snow didn't melt at all, and the sky stayed a dull, unbroken white. I went out to check my truck again, brushing off the snow and making sure it would start if I needed to leave early. As I worked, I saw new tracks in the snow. Not the ones from before, but fresh ones, leading from behind the cabin toward the trees. These were closer together, like whoever made them was taking smaller steps. Again, they stopped abruptly at the tree-line. I walked toward them slowly, scanning the forest. The trees stood silent, their branches heavy with snow. I didn't go in. Instead, I circled the cabin, checking for anything unusual. Everything looked normal. I spent the rest of the day inside, splitting kindling, reading, and trying not to think about the prints. But by evening, the wind had died completely, and the stillness outside was almost oppressive. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, soft crunches, spaced apart. Footsteps on snow. My chest tightened. I stayed still, listening. The steps were slow, moving somewhere near the front of the cabin. Then they stopped. I waited, straining my ears, but there was nothing else for several minutes. Finally, I reached for my flashlight and pointed it toward the window, but the thick curtains blocked most of the light from going out. I didn't move them aside. The next morning, I saw more tracks. They were right in front of the porch this time, coming from the left side of the cabin and stopping at the steps. No return prints again. My stomach sank as I realized these couldn't just be random. Someone had been walking up to my cabin in the middle of the night and leaving without a trace, or without going back the same way. I decided I needed to leave the next day, even though I had planned to stay longer. The road might still be rough, but I didn't want to spend another night here. I spent the day keeping busy, double-checking my gear and stacking firewood in case I needed it for the night. As the sun began to set, I locked the door and kept my flashlight close. The wind picked up after dark, rattling the windows. I sat near the stove trying to read, but I kept glancing at the door. Hours passed like that until, just past midnight, the wind stopped completely again. The silence that followed felt heavy. Then I heard it, those same slow, deliberate crunches in the snow, moving toward the porch. My pulse thudded in my ears. The steps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. I sat frozen for what felt like minutes, waiting for something to happen. The cabin was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. Then there was a new sound, a faint, slow scrape, like something brushing against the wall near the door. I gripped my flashlight, my mouth dry. The scrape moved along the wall toward the window. I didn't open the curtains. Instead, I stayed still until the sound stopped. Eventually, after what must have been half an hour, I heard the crunch of footsteps moving away into the snow, slower this time, until they faded completely. When I finally looked outside in the morning, the sight made my skin crawl. The fresh tracks didn't lead back toward the trees. They went around the side of the cabin, stopped a few feet away, and simply ended, as if the person had just vanished. That was enough. I packed my things, brushed the snow from my truck, and drove back down the road without looking back. The drive out was tense, my eyes scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. Later, when I told a local about it, they said sometimes there were squatters or people living deep in the woods who didn't want to be found. I never found out who it was or why they had come to my cabin, but I still think about those tracks, how they stopped without going back, and how close they came while I was sleeping inside. I haven't rented another cabin since. It was late October when I decided to spend a week alone at a small cabin deep in the mountains. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to an old coworker who said he rarely used it anymore. It sat about 3 miles off a narrow gravel road that wound through miles of forest. You had to drive until the gravel ended, then walk the last half-mile along a rough dirt track that was too overgrown for vehicles. I thought I wanted peace and quiet. I thought a week away from people, phone service, and the constant noise of the city would be good for me. The first day went fine. The air was cool. The leaves were in full autumn color, and the only sounds were the wind and the occasional distant caw of a raven. I unpacked my gear slowly, making the cabin feel like a temporary home. It was a single-room structure with a loft for sleeping, a wood stove, a small table, and shelves stacked with old cans of food. There was no electricity. Water came from a hand pump about 20 feet behind the cabin. That first night, I went to bed early. The quiet was heavy, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you hear your own heartbeat. I drifted in and out of sleep, waking now and then when the wind rattled the shutters. The second day started clear but turned gray by mid-afternoon. Clouds rolled in low over the ridges, and the temperature dropped quickly. I spent the day gathering more firewood from a pile out back and stacking it beside the stove. I didn't think much about the fact that the pile looked like it had been picked over recently, as though someone had already taken some of it. I assumed maybe animals had pulled pieces loose. By the third day, I noticed something strange. In the dirt around the cabin, there were boot prints. At first I thought they might be mine from hauling wood or going to the pump, but the tread was different, deeper, with a narrow heel. They were fresh, too. The damp soil from last night's drizzle still held their shape. They came from the direction of the trail and stopped just a few feet from the door before turning back. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my coworker had checked on the place recently. Maybe hunters were passing through. But the idea of someone walking right up to the cabin and then leaving without knocking or announcing themselves sat wrong with me. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind picked up, shaking the roof beams. Around midnight, I thought I heard a dull thud outside, like something hitting the porch. I sat still in bed, listening. The stove was still warm, the faint crackle of cooling metal in the air. I stayed awake until the wind eased and my eyelids finally dropped. On the fourth morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. The boot prints were there again, fresh ones. They came up to the porch and stopped near the steps. This time there were 2 sets, one from yesterday faded, and a new, sharper set on top of them. My stomach tightened. I decided to stay closer to the cabin that day. I stacked more firewood and kept my knife on my belt. I tried to read an old paperback from the shelf, but every little creak of the wood or tap of a branch made me look toward the door. By late afternoon, the light faded earlier than usual. Heavy clouds turned the forest into a dark maze of black trunks and wet leaves. I lit the oil lamp early and made a small dinner on the stove. When I stepped outside to pump water, I noticed something else. The small stack of wood I'd piled that morning was scattered. A few logs were lying 10 feet away in the wet leaves. That night was worse. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a faint scraping sound. Not the wind, not an animal. A slow, deliberate scrape against the wood siding of the cabin. I lay completely still, heart hammering. The sound stopped. I waited, barely breathing, then heard the soft crunch of a boot in the wet leaves. I didn't move until the first gray light of dawn. My shoulders ached from lying tense for hours. When I finally looked outside, the ground was covered in new prints. They circled the cabin twice before heading back into the trees. On the 5th day, I decided I couldn't relax here anymore. My original plan was to stay a week, but something was wrong. Someone was coming around at night, and I didn't know why. I spent the morning packing my gear. I told myself I'd hike back to my truck and leave before dark. But just as I was about to go, the rain started. Not a drizzle, but a hard, steady downpour that turned the dirt trail to mud. The sky was so dark it looked like evening. Hiking 3 miles back to the road in that weather felt risky, especially with slick leaves underfoot. I decided to wait it out until morning. The hours dragged. The rain drummed on the roof without stopping. Every so often, I thought I heard something else. A faint knock, the creak of the porch boards, but I told myself it was the weather. By nightfall, I had the stove going full, more for comfort than warmth. Around midnight, I woke again. this time to a different sound. A slow, soft press on the porch boards, followed by another. Someone was stepping carefully, trying not to make noise. My chest tightened. I stared at the black shape of the door, every nerve awake. The steps stopped. Then came a faint rustling near the window. I remembered the old rifle my coworker kept in the loft. I reached up quietly and pulled it down, keeping my eyes on the window. I stayed that way for hours, muscles burning, until the sound faded into the storm. When daylight came, the rain had stopped. I opened the door to a shock. Deep, wet boot prints covered the porch. The top step was muddy, as if someone had stood there for a long time. And there was something else. A fresh cut in the wood frame of the window, as though someone had tried to pry it open. That was it. I packed fast, barely stopping to eat. I strapped my pack tight and left the cabin without looking back. The trail was slick, but I moved quickly, scanning the trees on either side. Twice I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I stopped, the only sound was water dripping from the branches. It took me over an hour to reach my truck. When I got there, my stomach dropped. Someone had been here too. The passenger side door was ajar, and muddy prints led from the road into the trees. I didn't stop to check for missing items. I started the truck and drove until I hit pavement, only pulling over in the next town. My hands were still shaking as I sat in the gas station lot, watching the door. I never told my coworker the full story. I just said the cabin felt too isolated for me. But I still think about those boot prints, about how they kept coming back night after night, getting bolder. And I think about that last morning, how the prints at the cabin and the prints at my truck were the same size, the same tread. Someone had been watching me from the first day. And I think if the rain hadn't kept me from leaving sooner, I might have met them on that trail, and maybe I wouldn't have made it out. I drove out to the mountains that Friday with the same idea I'd been holding on to for weeks, just a quiet, solitary weekend away from work, traffic, and people. I'd found a small, privately owned cabin listed for rent deep in the forest near Wolf Creek. It was an older building, nothing fancy, single story, wooden siding gone gray with age, tin roof that looked like it had seen decades of snow. I'd picked it partly because it was cheap and partly because it was so far from anywhere that it almost seemed forgotten. The listing mentioned there was no phone service and no internet, just a shortwave radio for emergencies, but that was fine. I wanted silence. I started my trip early in the morning. The paved road out of town gave way to gravel after an hour, then to dirt, twisting and narrowing until it barely fit my truck. The forest pressed in on both sides, dense spruce and pine, their needles black-green against the overcast sky. I remember the air getting colder as I climbed higher into the foothills, the smell of wet earth and wood resin seeping through my half-open window. The directions to the cabin weren't exact, more like a set of clues. Follow the main track until you pass a rusted cattle gate on the left, then take a sharp right onto a barely visible trail. The trail dipped and swayed like it hadn't been graded in years. It was late afternoon before the trees parted just enough for me to catch sight of it. The cabin stood in a small clearing choked with tall grass and wild shrubs. The porch leaned slightly, boards warped from decades of rain. There was a single front window, dusty and dim, and a narrow chimney stack rising from the roof. A wooden shed sat a little to the left, its door hanging crooked on one hinge. Beyond the clearing, the forest resumed, thick, dark, and endless. I parked on a patch of flattened grass and climbed out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was still and heavy. I could hear the faint rush of water somewhere nearby, probably the creek the place was named for. My boots crunched on gravel as I crossed to the porch. The door was unlocked, just as the owner had promised. It opened with a drawn-out groan. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of dust, pine sap, and something else, maybe old smoke from the stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The room was one large space with a small kitchen tucked into the corner. A single bed sat against the far wall, covered in a faded quilt. There was a wooden table, two mismatched chairs, and a low shelf lined with chipped enamel plates. A narrow door near the bed led to a bathroom no bigger than a closet. It wasn't much, but I hadn't come for comfort. I dropped my duffel on the bed and unpacked a few things: flashlight, spare batteries, a hunting knife, and enough food for 3 days. My plan was to hike some of the old trails I'd read about, maybe do some sketching or writing. The nearest other building was miles away, and that was exactly how I liked it. By the time I'd settled in, the sun was dipping low. I made a simple meal, lit one of the oil lamps from the shelf, and sat on the porch to eat. The forest darkened quickly, the trees merging into a single black wall. Somewhere out there, a night bird called once, twice, then fell silent. I stayed outside until the chill sank into my hands, then locked the door and went to bed. I woke in the middle of the night, not from a noise, at least not one I could remember, but from the sense that something had changed. The cabin was silent except for the faint ticking of the metal stove cooling in the corner. The lamp was out, the room lit only by a sliver of moonlight through the window. I lay still, listening. Outside, the forest should have been full of quiet night sounds: wind in the trees, insects, maybe the distant rush of the creek. But it was too still. The silence pressed in. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day, I followed a faint trail north through the woods. The ground was soft from recent rain, the air cool and damp. After about an hour, I reached the creek, a narrow ribbon of clear water tumbling over stones. I sat for a while, listening to the water and eating a small lunch. There were no footprints on the muddy banks, no sign anyone had been here recently. When I got back to the cabin that afternoon, I noticed something strange. My duffel bag, which I'd left zipped on the bed, was partly open. At first I thought maybe I'd forgotten to close it, but then I saw that a few things had been shifted. My flashlight was on the wrong side, and the notebook I'd left at the bottom was now on top. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out if I'd done it myself and simply forgotten. It didn't make sense, but I brushed it off. Maybe I'd just been tired when I unpacked. I spent the evening reading an old paperback I'd brought, then went to bed early. This time I woke to a sound. It was faint, but clear: the crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps moving around the side toward the porch. My heart thudded hard in my chest. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, grabbed the hunting knife from the table, and stood still, listening. The steps stopped just outside the wall. The silence stretched on for several seconds. Then I heard the soft creak of the porch boards. Whoever it was, they were right outside the door. I waited, every muscle tense. After a long moment, the boards creaked again, this time moving away. Then nothing. I didn't hear footsteps retreat into the forest, just that sudden return of silence. I stayed awake for hours after that, knife in hand, until exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, I went outside to check. The grass was wet with dew, but I could see faint impressions where someone had stepped. Flattened patches leading from the tree-line to the porch. They weren't animal prints. They were human. I told myself it could be a hunter or a hiker passing through, though the idea didn't sit right. This place was too far from any marked trail. I decided to keep the door locked and my knife close from then on. That afternoon, I heard movement in the forest while chopping wood. It wasn't close, more like something pacing the edge of the clearing, just out of sight. Every time I stopped to listen, it stopped too. I never saw anything, but the feeling of being watched grew heavier as the hours went by. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they circled the cabin slowly, pausing now and then before moving on. I sat in the dark, breathing shallow, gripping the knife so tightly my hand ached. I didn't dare light the lamp. Eventually, the sounds faded, but I didn't sleep again. By the third day, my nerves were raw. I decided to leave a day early. I began packing as soon as the sun rose, moving quickly but trying not to think about the fact that I still had to walk to the truck in that silent clearing. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something I hadn't before. Small scratches near the bottom of the doorframe, like someone had run the tip of a knife or a nail along the wood. They were fresh. When I reached my truck, my stomach dropped. The rear left tire was flat, completely deflated. I checked it closely. There was a clean, deliberate cut in the rubber, not a puncture from a rock or branch. My spare was in the bed, but I'd never changed a tire in such an exposed place before, with the forest pressing so close. The entire time I worked, I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me. My hands shook, making the job take longer than it should have. When I finally got the spare in place, I threw my gear into the cab without bothering to pack it properly and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt track, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall, motionless, watching. Then the trees swallowed the view. It took me over 2 hours to get back to the main road. When I finally saw another vehicle, the tension in my shoulders eased for the first time in days. I didn't stop until I was well past town. I never went back to that cabin, and I never contacted the owner to explain why. But I think about it often. Those slow footsteps in the dark, the cut tire, the fresh scratches on the door. Someone had been out there, watching, moving just close enough to let me know they were there, but never revealing themselves fully. And that's what stays with me the most. Not knowing who they were, not knowing how long they'd been watching before I even heard them, and not knowing if they might follow. I never planned to spend the winter alone in a cabin. It wasn't my kind of thing. I preferred the noise of the city, the movement of people, the glow of streetlights at night. But I'd been running on empty for years, overworked, restless, and burnt out. When a coworker mentioned that her family had an old cabin in the mountains that nobody used anymore, it sounded like a way to breathe for a while. The place was remote, she warned me, far from cell service, and the only road up there was tricky in winter. I told her I'd be fine. I didn't realize then how far remote could stretch. It took me nearly 6 hours of driving, most of it along winding mountain roads, before I reached the point where the paved road ended and the dirt track began. The dirt track was narrow, lined by bare trees whose thin branches clattered against each other in the cold wind. My tires kicked up frozen dust, and the late afternoon light was already fading. The cabin, she said, was another 20 minutes up the track, but I didn't pass a single other car. It felt like I was driving out of the world I knew and into something much older, quieter, and indifferent. By the time I saw the cabin, the sun was slipping behind the mountains. The place was smaller than I'd pictured, dark wood weathered to a grayish tone, the roof heavy with old snow. It sat in a small clearing, the forest pressing close on all sides. There was no garage, just an uneven patch of dirt where I parked. My breath came out in clouds as I stepped out, the cold sharp enough to make my nose sting. I hauled my bags up the 3 steps to the porch, the boards groaning under my weight. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The cabin was one large room, a sleeping loft above, and a tiny kitchen tucked in the corner. The furniture was old but sturdy, the kind that looked like it had been there for decades. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a pile of split logs stacked beside it. I set my bags down and moved quickly, lighting the oil lamp on the table and getting a fire going before the last of the daylight died. The wood caught slowly, the smell of smoke filling the room until the chimney pulled it up and out. By the time the fire was burning well, the cabin felt a little less like a forgotten shell. I unpacked what I'd brought, mostly canned food, a few changes of clothes, some books, and my laptop for writing. I knew there wouldn't be internet here, but I figured I could at least type offline and keep myself occupied. The silence outside was so complete it was almost a sound in itself. I told myself I'd get used to it. The first couple of days passed quietly. I walked a little in the woods during daylight, though I didn't go far. The snow was deep in places, and I wasn't familiar with the area. At night, I read by the fire, listening to the wind in the trees. Once or twice I thought I heard faint noises, something shifting outside, the crunch of snow. But I told myself it was just branches falling or the cabin settling in the cold. On the 3rd day, I noticed something strange. In the thin snow at the edge of the clearing, there were tracks. They weren't from an animal I recognized. Too long for a deer, too narrow for a bear. The steps were spaced far apart, as if whoever or whatever had made them had taken long, deliberate strides. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared into the trees. It wasn't unusual for hunters or hikers to be around in the warmer months. But in the dead of winter, this high up, it seemed unlikely. I shook it off and spent most of the day inside, but I checked again before it got dark. The tracks were still there, crisp and sharp, as if they'd been made recently. That night, I pushed the couch closer to the fireplace and lay there for a long time, staring at the flickering light on the ceiling before falling asleep. The next morning, there were more tracks. This time, they came closer across the clearing, curving toward the porch steps before veering off again into the woods. My stomach tightened when I saw them. The snow was fresh from the night before, which meant someone had been here after I'd gone to sleep. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a lost hiker had stumbled on the cabin and kept moving. But the distance between me and the nearest neighbor was miles. In this weather, wandering around at night could kill you. The idea that someone might be out there, circling my cabin, started to wedge itself into my mind like a splinter. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the fire low and listened. Around midnight, I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of snow underfoot. Slow, deliberate steps. My heart started to hammer. I lay completely still, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tight. The steps came closer, circling the cabin. I couldn't see anything from where I was, and I didn't want to move to the window. After a few minutes, the sound faded, swallowed by the wind. In the morning, I checked. The snow was marked with a perfect circle of tracks around the cabin, a few coming close to the porch. Whoever it was, they were watching me. I felt exposed in a way I never had before. The trees, once peaceful, now felt like walls closing in. Every dark space between them seemed like a place for someone to hide. I started keeping the hatchet from the woodpile inside, propped against the wall near where I slept. I told myself it was just in case, though in case of what, I didn't want to say out loud even in my head. I kept the fire going all day, more for comfort than warmth. On the fifth night, it got worse. I was drifting in and out of sleep when a noise pulled me fully awake. A faint creak from the porch. My pulse jumped. I strained my ears. Another creak, then the soft thud of something against the door. I sat up slowly, my breath shallow. The doorknob rattled once, then again harder. I gripped the hatchet, staring at the door, knowing it wouldn't take much to break it down. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I sat there for the rest of the night, my eyes on the door, the hatchet cold in my hands. First light, I checked. More tracks, this time straight to the door. The prints were deep, as if the person had stood there for a while. I didn't even bother trying to convince myself it was nothing. Someone was trying to get inside. The rest of the day, I was on edge. I jumped at every sound, even the normal ones. The fire popping, the wind pushing against the cabin walls. I thought about leaving, but the snow had been falling steadily all morning, and I wasn't sure my car could make it down the mountain. If I got stuck halfway, I'd be even worse off. That night, I set up a barricade with the small table and one of the chairs pushed against the door. It wouldn't stop someone determined, but it might give me a few seconds to react. I lay down on the couch again, the hatchet within reach. Hours passed in darkness and silence, broken only by the wind. Then came the sound I'd been dreading. Footsteps in the snow. Slow, steady, unhurried. They stopped just outside. The boards of the porch groaned, and the doorknob turned with a slow, deliberate click. The table shuddered against the door. My throat felt tight. The knob turned again, harder. Then there was a long pause and a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged along the wall outside. The steps moved to the window. I could feel the cold seeping in where the glass met the frame. They stayed there for what felt like forever. Then, finally, the sound faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all. When daylight came, I packed. The snow was deep, but I didn't care. I threw my bags into the car, scraped the ice from the windshield with shaking hands, and started down the track. The road was treacherous, but I kept going inch by inch until I saw the first sign of another human being. A snowplow clearing the lower road. When I finally reached cell service, I called the sheriff's office. They said they'd send someone up, but their tone made it clear they didn't expect to find much. Maybe they didn't believe me, Maybe they'd been up there before for other calls like mine. I didn't go back to find out. That was 3 years ago. I haven't been back to the mountains since. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up certain I've heard the sound of footsteps outside my window, slow and deliberate, as if they're waiting for me to fall back asleep. I had planned the trip months in advance, back when the summer heat still made the idea of being in the cold seem almost pleasant. The cabin I had booked was deep in the forest, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest small town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden structure. No neighbors in sight, no running water, no electricity. I had chosen it specifically because it was remote. I wanted time away from everything, away from work, away from people, away from the constant noise. I arrived in late October. The trees had mostly shed their leaves, leaving a carpet of orange, brown, and yellow that crunched under my boots as I carried my supplies from the car to the cabin. The air had a sharp bite, cold enough to sting my nose when I breathed in too quickly. The sun sat low in the sky, even though it was only mid-afternoon, and shadows from the bare trees stretched long and thin across the ground. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, with a single room that held a small bed against the wall, a wood stove in the corner, and a table with 2 chairs. The walls were rough and weathered, the kind of wood that looked like it had been holding the place together for decades. It smelled faintly of old smoke and pine. There was a single window facing the forest and another smaller one near the bed that faced the slope leading down toward a frozen creek. I stacked my gear inside sleeping bag, canned food, a camp stove, lantern, and enough firewood to get me through the week. I also had a rifle, mostly for peace of mind. This deep in the woods, I knew there were animals, bears, coyotes, maybe even wolves. I wasn't planning to hunt, but I liked knowing I had it. That first day was quiet. Too quiet, actually. I hadn't realized how constant the background noise of life was until I was without it. No distant cars, no hum of appliances, no voices, no faint music leaking from someone else's life. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin. First, it was peaceful. I explored a little before it got dark, walking the slope behind the cabin to where the creek ran. The water was still moving under a thin sheet of ice, trickling around rocks and fallen branches. I followed it for a while, keeping track of my steps so I could find my way back easily. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped fast, and I headed back to the cabin. That night, I made a small fire in the stove and sat at the table, reading by lantern light. The fire crackled and popped, and every once in a while, I thought I heard something outside, branches snapping, the faint crunch of snow or frozen leaves. I brushed it off as animals moving through. Out here, it was their land more than mine. I slept well enough the first night, though I woke once to silence so deep it was almost suffocating. No wind, no creak of the cabin, nothing. I lay still, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting for anything to break the stillness. Eventually, I heard a single thump from outside, like something had dropped onto the ground. Then nothing again. My heart beat faster, but I told myself it was just ice falling from a branch or something similar. I fell back asleep eventually. The second day, I decided to hike further along the creek. The air felt heavier, the sky overcast and gray. I walked for hours, following the frozen water as it twisted deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker here, and the ground was littered with fallen logs and tangled underbrush. I didn't see any animals, but I found tracks, deer mostly, maybe a fox. On the way back, I noticed something strange about 100 yards from the cabin. There was a small clearing I hadn't seen before, with a half-collapsed wooden structure. It looked like it had been there for decades. Rotted beams, rusted nails sticking out at odd angles, part of a roof sagging toward the ground. I walked closer, curious. It was too small to be a full cabin, maybe an old shed or hunting blind. The wood was blackened in places, like it had once been burned. I stepped carefully around it, peering inside. There was nothing but dirt, leaves, and a few scraps of unrecognizable metal. Back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the image of that burned structure. Why had it been left there? It wasn't far from where I was staying, and if someone had abandoned it, I wondered why they hadn't torn it down completely. That night, I woke again to a noise outside. This time, it wasn't just one sound, it was several spaced apart. A crunch of leaves, then silence. Another crunch, closer. I sat up slowly, listening. My eyes were adjusted enough to the dark that I could make out the faint outline of the window, but I saw nothing beyond it. The fire in the stove had died down to glowing embers. I sat there for a long time, holding my breath. Eventually, the noises faded. I didn't hear footsteps leaving, just nothing again. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the stillness, until exhaustion finally pulled me under. The third day was colder, and the sky threatened snow. I stayed closer to the cabin, chopping more firewood and checking over my supplies. I kept glancing toward the trees, feeling watched, though I saw no movement. That night was worse. The noises came back, but they were closer, circling the cabin. Soft steps in the snow, slow and deliberate. My rifle was within reach, and I kept my hand on it, staring at the door. At one point, I heard something brush against the side of the cabin, like a coat sleeve dragging along the wall. Then a faint scrape near the window. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the stove until morning, every muscle tense, ears straining for every sound. By the fourth day, I wanted to leave. The cabin no longer felt like a retreat, felt like a trap. But the nearest town was hours away, and the path back wasn't well marked. The weather had worsened, wind howling through the trees, flurries of snow cutting visibility. I told myself I'd wait for it to clear before heading back. That night, the sounds returned, but this time, I saw movement. A shadow passed the window, tall and thin. My heart slammed against my ribs. I didn't move. The shadow moved again, slower this time, as if whoever or whatever it was looking inside. I grabbed the rifle and moved to the far corner of the cabin, keeping low. The fire was dead now, and the room was almost completely dark. I heard the crunch of steps at the front of the cabin, then the faintest rattle of the door handle. My breath caught. The handle moved again, harder this time. It stopped after a few seconds, but the steps didn't move away. They circled again, then silence. I stayed like that until the first pale light of morning. When I finally opened the door, there were footprints in the thin layer of snow outside, human footprints, barefoot. I left that morning. I packed everything in a rush, barely stopping to strap my gear. I didn't care about the cold or the wind. I walked until my legs shook and my hands went numb, until I saw my car again and the thin ribbon of road leading back to civilization. I didn't look back at the cabin, not once. Even now, I still think about those footprints. I had been miles from the nearest person, deep in the woods in freezing temperatures, and someone had been there, circling the cabin, trying the door, watching through the window. I don't know how long they'd been there before I noticed, and I don't want to know how long they would have stayed if I hadn't left when I did. I rented the cabin because I wanted to get away from the noise. Life in the city had been wearing me down. The constant rumble of traffic, the flashing lights at night, the thin walls between apartments where I could hear neighbors arguing through the plaster. I thought a week alone, somewhere quiet, would reset my head. The ad for the place said it was in a remote patch of hills, about 2 hours from the nearest town, with no neighbors for miles. The photos showed a small wooden building on a slope, surrounded by tall pines and thick brush. The kind of place where you could walk outside at night and hear nothing but your own breathing. I drove there on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. The air got colder the further I went, the leaves more orange and brown, the road narrower. Eventually, the pavement ended, and I was driving on a dirt path that wound between trees. My phone had no service. The dirt road climbed steadily until it finally reached a clearing where the cabin sat. It was smaller than I expected, just a single level with a front porch, a sloped roof, and a single chimney. The wood siding was dark and weathered. It looked like it had been there for decades. The owner had left the key in a metal box beside the door. The cabin's interior smelled faintly of wood smoke, like someone had recently lit the fireplace. There was one main room with a couch, a small kitchen area, and a hallway that led to a bedroom and a bathroom. The windows were narrow, and the glass had that slightly warped look you see in old buildings. Out back, there was a deck that overlooked a steep drop into a valley. Beyond that was nothing but a dense wall of pine trees. It was cold enough inside that I could see my breath. I lit the wood stove in the corner and waited for the air to warm. I unpacked, putting my food in the small fridge and my clothes in the single dresser in the bedroom. The place was simple: no TV, no internet, and a radio on the kitchen counter that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The first day was peaceful. I spent most of it on the deck, reading and watching the wind move through the trees. In the evening, I made dinner and sat by the stove until the shadows filled the corners of the room. When I went to bed, the silence was so deep it almost made my ears ring. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to use the bathroom. The cabin was pitch dark. I fumbled for my flashlight and went down the hallway. As I passed the front door, I thought I heard something outside. Not close, just faint. A crunching sound, like footsteps on frozen leaves. I stood still and listened, holding my breath. After a few seconds, it stopped. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, and went back to bed. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I followed a faint trail down into the valley. The air was damp, and the ground was covered in fallen pine needles. The deeper I went, the darker it got, the trees closing in overhead. After about a mile, I came across an old wooden structure, maybe an abandoned shed or hunting cabin. It was collapsing in on itself, the roof caved in, the walls leaning. I didn't go inside, but I circled it. There were no signs of recent activity, just rotting wood and moss. On the way back to my cabin, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A narrow footpath branching off from the main trail, almost hidden by undergrowth. It looked like it led uphill toward a ridge. I considered following it, but decided I didn't want to get lost. That night, it was harder to relax. I kept remembering the faint footsteps from the night before. I made sure the door was locked and pulled the curtains shut. Still, as I lay in bed, I had the sense that the woods outside felt different now, not just empty, but watchful. I woke up again around 1 a.m., this time to a sound that was definitely closer. A slow, deliberate crunching on the frozen ground outside the cabin. My first thought was that it could be a bear, but the steps were spaced too far apart and too evenly to be an animal on four legs. I stayed still, listening. The steps came around the side of the cabin and stopped beneath the bedroom window. My skin prickled. I didn't move for what felt like a long time. Eventually, the steps started again, heading toward the front of the cabin, and then they stopped. I strained to hear more, but the night was silent again. After maybe half an hour, I forced myself to get up and peek through the curtain. There was nothing there, just the dark outline of the porch railing and the faint glint of frost on the ground. The next morning, I found fresh footprints in the frost. They weren't boot prints, more like the tread of old, worn shoes. They led from the trees to the porch and back again. My stomach tightened. I tried to convince myself it could have been a hiker who got lost, but there were no other cabins nearby. I spent the day on edge, glancing out the windows every few minutes. I even thought about packing up and leaving early, but I didn't want to overreact. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing, just some drifter passing through. That night, I stayed up late by the stove, too tense to sleep. Around midnight, the noises started again. Slow steps in the frost moving around the cabin. I turned off the light and sat in the dark, listening. The steps circled twice before stopping outside the front door. Then I heard the faintest creak of the porch boards, like someone shifting their weight. This time, I didn't look. I stayed frozen in my chair until the steps finally faded into the distance. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed quickly and went outside to load the car. That's when I saw something on the porch, a small object placed neatly by the door. It was a smooth, round stone with a piece of string tied tightly around it. I didn't touch it. I drove down the dirt road, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror over and over. The trees closed in on both sides, and I didn't see another vehicle the whole way out. When I reached the first paved road and my phone finally got service, I called the owner and told them I was leaving early. They didn't seem surprised. They just said, "All right," and hung up. I never went back. I had been looking for some time alone. My life in the city had become loud, crowded, and full of distractions. I wanted a place far away from traffic, from the sound of people's phones ringing, from neon lights bleeding through my bedroom window at night. A friend of mine mentioned a small, old hunting cabin her family owned but hadn't used in years. It sat deep in a valley, surrounded by thick woods, miles from the nearest paved road. She warned me it wasn't fancy, no electricity, no running water, and a wood stove for heat. That was exactly what I wanted. I left early on a cool September morning, my car packed with supplies. Canned food, a big water container, a flashlight with extra batteries, sleeping bag, matches, a hatchet, and my camping gear. The drive started smooth, but the farther I went, the rougher the road became. Pavement turned to gravel, gravel to dirt, and then the dirt narrowed until it felt like a single lane. I slowed to avoid potholes and rocks. Trees closed in overhead, their branches casting long shadows across the hood. I drove for nearly an hour without passing another car. When I finally reached the spot where the road ended, there was a small clearing just big enough to park. A faint trail led down through the woods. I could see no buildings from there. I slung my pack over my shoulder, grabbed the rest of my gear, and started down the trail. The air was crisp and quiet, except for the sound of my boots crunching on dry leaves. The walk to the cabin took about 20 minutes. The trees were dense, the trail uneven. My shoulders ached from the weight of the supplies. When I reached the cabin, it appeared suddenly through the trees, small, square, weathered with dark wood siding and a sagging metal roof. The porch had 2 steps, one of them loose. The windows were dusty, and the door looked old but solid. Inside, the air was stale, with the faint smell of wood smoke and dampness. The main room held a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. There was no kitchen, just a counter with a few old tin pans and a dented kettle. A door in the corner led to a tiny storage room where I found a few stacked firewood logs, though most were too damp to use without drying them out. I set my things down and opened the small shutters to let some light in. Dust floated in the sunlight. Outside, the valley spread out beyond the clearing, with the forest walls rising up on all sides. Felt far removed from the world. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to organize everything. I kept my water container near the door, set my food on the table, and stacked my sleeping bag on the cot. By late afternoon, I had gathered some dry kindling and wood from fallen branches outside. I started a fire in the stove, the smell of burning pine filling the cabin. The warmth was welcome. The temperature had already dropped. I cooked a can of soup over the small flame, eating it with bread. When the light faded, the darkness came fast. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the black. Outside, the forest was a wall of shadow. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. That first night passed quietly. I woke once to adjust my sleeping bag, hearing the faint rustle of something outside, probably a raccoon or deer. In the morning, the air was damp and cold. Mist hung low in the valley. I boiled water for coffee on the stove and sat on the porch steps, watching the fog move through the trees. The days settled into a slow rhythm. I spent the mornings gathering wood, checking the trail, and making sure the roof wasn't leaking. In the afternoons, I explored the woods. The valley was deep, the trees thick with moss. Fallen logs crossed shallow streams. I found old animal tracks in the mud, deer, maybe fox. Once, I saw the flash of a hawk above the treetops. But after a few days, I began to notice small things that made me uneasy. The first was a single footprint in the mud near the cabin. It was faint, but the shape was human. It wasn't mine. It was too small and narrow. I thought maybe it was old, left by someone years ago, preserved in the shade. Still, it stayed in my mind. A couple of nights later, I woke to the faint sound of movement outside. Not the quick rustle of an animal. This was slower, like careful steps. I lay still in my bag, the fire in the stove down to glowing embers. The steps seemed to move around the side of the cabin. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. Eventually, the sound faded. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe a deer circling. The next day, I found something odd. A piece of bark wedged between the porch steps and the door frame. It was small, almost like someone had placed it there deliberately. I tossed it aside, trying not to overthink it. As the week went on, the feeling of being alone changed into something heavier. I started checking the tree line often, scanning for movement. When I went to gather wood, I would glance back at the cabin more than once. Sometimes I thought I saw a darker patch among the trees, like someone standing still, but when I looked again, it was gone. On the sixth night, it rained hard. Wind rattled the shutters. I sat near the stove, drying my clothes, listening to the sound of water dripping from the roof. At one point, I thought I heard the sound of something scraping against the wall outside, slow and rough. I froze, my hand on the flashlight. After a minute, it stopped. I didn't open the door to check. In the morning, I stepped outside to find a small pile of stones stacked neatly beside the porch. They hadn't been there the day before. The rain had washed everything else clean, but the stones were arranged carefully, balanced in a way the wind wouldn't do. My stomach tightened. I walked the clearing's edge, scanning the forest. There was no sound, not even a bird. That day, I didn't wander far. I stayed close to the cabin, keeping my hatchet nearby. Every sound seemed sharper, the snap of a twig, the shift of leaves. I cooked early and locked the door when the light began to fade. That night, I barely slept. The fire burned low, shadows moving across the walls. At some point, I heard the sound of slow steps again, this time closer, circling the cabin. Then there was a faint knock on the wall just once. My breathing grew shallow. I didn't move until the first light of morning came through the cracks in the shutters. When I finally stepped outside, the stones were gone. I decided to leave the next day. The idea of staying longer made my skin crawl. I packed slowly, keeping watch on the tree line. I made sure everything was ready for a quick departure in the morning. That night was the longest of my life. It began quietly. The forest was still. I lay in my sleeping bag, the hatchet beside me. But around midnight, I woke to the sound of the door latch shifting. Not much, just a soft, quick movement like someone testing it. I held my breath. The latch moved again, a little harder this time. The door held. Then the steps came, deliberate, slow, moving along the porch, then around to the side. Something brushed against the wall. My hands were sweating. I kept my eyes on the door, knowing there was nothing between me and the outside but old wood. Minutes passed. Then, suddenly, there was a loud, heavy thud against the back wall, strong enough to shake the frame. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. I gripped the hatchet, not moving. The steps retreated after that. I lay there, every muscle tense, until the first pale light of dawn. When I opened the door that morning, the clearing was empty. No footprints, no stones, nothing out of place. But I didn't care anymore. I loaded my pack, grabbed my gear, and walked quickly up the trail. I didn't look back at the cabin. By the time I reached my car, my shoulders ached from the pace. I drove fast, the dirt road blurring under the tires. I didn't slow until I hit pavement. Only then did I breathe deeply. I never went back to that valley. I don't know if someone was living out there, watching me. I don't know why they left stones or moved around the cabin at night. But I know they were there and they wanted me to know it too. I had been looking forward to that weekend for months. Life had been heavy and repetitive, and I thought a couple of quiet days in a rented cabin would reset my mind. It was supposed to be simple. Drive out early Saturday morning, spend 2 nights, drive back Monday afternoon. The place I picked wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden cabin deep in a quiet part of the forest, far from the main roads. I had seen pictures online. A front porch with 2 old rocking chairs, a narrow gravel driveway, and a clearing that opened just enough to let the sunlight pour in during the day. The photos made it look peaceful. The drive there was long, close to 4 hours from home. I left before sunrise to avoid traffic, stopping only once for gas and coffee. The farther I got from the main highway, the more isolated it felt. The roads turned narrower, the trees closer to the edge of the pavement, their branches meeting overhead like a tunnel. By the time I turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, I hadn't seen another car for almost 30 minutes. The driveway was barely wide enough for my vehicle, lined with tall grass and low-hanging branches that scraped softly against the roof as I eased my way in. The cabin sat back about 50 yards from where the driveway ended. The air smelled clean, mixed with that damp, earthy scent of old leaves and pine. When I stepped out, I could hear nothing but the distant call of a bird and the faint rush of wind moving through the forest. The cabin was smaller than I expected, maybe 20 feet wide, but solid-looking. The wood siding was dark and weathered, and the roof was covered with dull brown shingles. The porch creaked under my steps. I unlocked the door with the key I had been mailed, the old brass turning stiffly in the lock. Inside, it was quiet and dim, the only light coming from 2 small windows. The main room was open, kitchen in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a couch facing a wood stove. Off to the left was a single bedroom with a narrow bed, and beyond that, a tiny bathroom with a shower and a toilet. Everything had that faint woody smell, mixed with a hint of something older, maybe the mustiness of being closed up for weeks. I unpacked quickly. I kept my bag in the bedroom, stored some food in the small fridge, and stacked the rest of my supplies on the counter. My plan was to take a short hike on one of the trails I'd seen marked on the area map, then come back and relax for the rest of the day. By mid-morning, I was heading out on foot. The trailhead was about 50 yards from the cabin, marked by a faded wooden sign. The trail itself was narrow but easy to follow, winding between tall trees and crossing small dips in the ground. I walked for maybe an hour before turning back, enjoying the stillness and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. When I got back, the cabin looked exactly as I'd left it. The sun was higher now, lighting up the clearing. I made a quick lunch, ate on the porch, and read a book for a while. The peace of the place made it easy to relax. But by late afternoon, the light began to change. Shadows stretched long across the clearing, and the air cooled faster than I expected. I decided to start a fire in the wood stove for warmth before it got too dark. The wood pile was stacked neatly against the side of the cabin. I brought in an armful, lit the stove, and sat back to listen to the faint crackle of burning logs. Outside, the forest was growing darker. The sounds of birds faded, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves. I didn't think much of it until I heard something heavier than leaves moving. It came from behind the cabin. Not close, but heavy enough to make me pause. I sat still, listening. The sound came again. Slow, deliberate steps through the underbrush. My first thought was deer. The woods were full of them, and they often wandered near cabins. But the sound stopped abruptly, as if whatever it was had become still too. I waited for a while, then went back to reading. The fire kept the room warm, and soon the quiet felt normal again. By the time I noticed it was fully dark outside, the fire had burned low, and the air inside was cooling. I added more wood and decided to call it a night. I locked the front door out of habit, though I doubted anyone would be wandering around this deep in the forest. The bedroom window had no curtain, but it faced the side of the clearing, so I figured it was fine. I lay down, the distant crackle of the fire still audible, and drifted towards sleep. Sometime later, hours maybe, I woke up without knowing why. The cabin was completely dark except for a faint orange glow from the stove in the other room. My ears strained against the silence. Then I heard it, crunching in the grass outside. It was slow, steady, and close, not on the gravel driveway, but in the clearing maybe 20 feet from the cabin. I stayed completely still, heart pounding. The steps continued, circling, pausing at times as if whoever or whatever it was looking around. My first thought was that it was an animal again. But then there was another sound, the faint, unmistakable squeak of a porch board under weight. Someone was outside. The The steps moved across the porch slowly. Then I heard the soft, metallic rattle of the front door handle being tested. Just once, then nothing. I stayed frozen in bed, barely breathing. I listened for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes. Eventually, the sound moved away. Slow steps down the porch, across the clearing, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that. When dawn finally came, the clearing looked exactly the same as before. I checked the door, locked. No footprints I could clearly see in the grass. Maybe I had imagined it, but the feeling didn't go away. For the rest of the morning, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the door locked, even when I was inside. The day was quiet again, but my mind kept replaying the sound of the porch creaking. By nightfall, the forest felt different, heavier somehow. I started the fire early, trying to make the place feel secure. The minutes after sunset were the worst. I could see almost nothing outside, just the faint outline of trees against a darkening sky. Sometime after I lay down, I heard it again. The crunch of grass. Slower this time. Closer. The steps circled just like the night before. They stopped near the bedroom window. I could feel the weight of someone standing there, even though I couldn't see them in the dark. My skin prickled. Then came the faintest scrape against the wall, like fingertips dragging lightly over the wood. I gripped the flashlight I had left by the bed but didn't turn it on. The sound moved along the wall toward the front of the cabin. Then, once again, the porch boards groaned. This time, the door handle rattled twice. Harder. I stayed awake the entire night, sitting in the bedroom with my back to the wall, listening to every sound. Sometime before dawn, the noises stopped. When the sun finally rose, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything in minutes. My hands shook as I loaded the car. The forest was silent again, but I could still feel eyes on me. As I drove away down that narrow driveway, I caught one last glimpse of the cabin in the rearview mirror, just sitting there, quiet, like nothing had happened. But I knew I'd never go back. I had been looking forward to a few quiet days away from everything. My work had been draining me for months. My head felt heavy all the time, and even the weekends weren't enough to recharge. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, far away from towns, streetlights, and traffic noise. The listing showed it tucked at the base of a ridge, with a dirt road winding down to it and nothing but trees in every direction. It looked simple but comfortable, just what I needed. I drove up on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the air feels a little sharper and cleaner than usual. The first couple of hours were on highways, then smaller country roads, then eventually onto a gravel track that wound through dense forest. My tires crunched over loose stones, and dust rose in the side mirrors like a pale cloud following me. The further I drove, the quieter it got. I passed no other cars. The forest grew taller, the trees pressing closer to the edges of the road until their branches interlaced overhead in places, making the light dim. After about 40 minutes of this slow drive through the woods, I came to a narrow turnoff marked by a weathered wooden sign leaning sideways. The letters had faded, but I could just make out the name of the cabin. I took the turn and crept along an even rougher path, the wheels bumping over ruts and exposed roots. Then the road began to slope down, and I could see the cabin at the bottom, half hidden by bare-limbed trees. It looked exactly like the photo's small, single-story, with a pitched roof and a front porch that sagged a little in the middle. I parked beside it, stepped out, and just stood there for a moment. The air was so still I could hear the faint ticking of my engine cooling down. No wind, no bird calls, no rustling, just silence. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and pine sap. I walked up the porch steps, the boards flexing under my weight, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. It was simple inside. A single main room with a couch, a low table, and a small wood stove in one corner. A kitchenette lined one wall with a compact fridge and an old electric range. Off to the right was a short hallway leading to a bedroom and a tiny bathroom. The floorboards creaked, and there was a faint musty smell, but everything was tidy. I set my bag on the couch, went back to the car for my cooler and a small duffel, and unpacked enough food for a few days, mostly canned stuff. bread, fruit, and bottled water. Once I had everything inside, I walked around outside for a while, just to get a feel for the place. Behind the cabin, the ground sloped gently upward into thick woods. The slope continued until it formed the ridge I'd seen in the listing photos, the top of it just visible through the branches. In front of the cabin, the ground fell away into a shallow hollow with a small stream trickling through it. Beyond the stream, more woods stretched out as far as I could see. It was isolated, all right. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I told myself that was the point, that this was exactly what I'd wanted, peace and quiet. But there was something about the stillness that pressed against me. Even in remote places, there's usually some sign of life, a bird calling, a squirrel chattering, a breeze moving leaves, but here, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The first afternoon passed uneventfully. I read for a while, made myself a sandwich, and later took a short walk down the stream. By the time the light began to fade, I was feeling more relaxed. I lit a small fire in the stove, not because I needed the heat yet, but for the comfort of it. Outside, the forest turned black quickly, the trees merging into a single wall of shadow. I locked the door, shut the curtains, and stayed inside until bed. That first night, I woke around 2 in the morning. At first, I thought it was just because I wasn't used to the bed, but then I realized I'd heard something, a sound outside. It had been faint, but enough to cut through my sleep. I lay still, listening. There it was again, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, then a pause, another crunch. It sounded like footsteps, but far enough away that I couldn't be certain. I stayed there, staring at the dark ceiling, my ears straining. The sound came again, this time a little closer. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be moving slowly around the side of the cabin. I thought about getting up to look, but the idea of being silhouetted in a lit window made me stay put. After a while, the sounds faded, replaced by silence so deep it was almost loud. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. In the morning, I tried to brush it off. Could have been a deer, I told myself. The woods were full of animals, and sounds carried strangely at night. Still, when I stepped outside, I looked for prints in the soft ground. I found some faint depressions in the leaf litter near the side of the cabin. They were too indistinct to tell much, but they were spaced more like human steps than an animal's. The second day, I hiked up the ridge behind the cabin. The slope was steeper than it had looked from below, and I had to grab at tree trunks to steady myself in places. From the top, I could see the cabin's roof through the trees, and beyond that, the hollow stretching out, the stream a silver thread winding through it. On the far side, the woods rose into another ridge, even taller and denser. I stayed up there for a while, enjoying the view, but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A couple of times, I thought I heard movement below me, but every time I stopped and listened, it was gone. That night, I made sure the door was locked and even wedged a chair under the knob, just in case. I kept a flashlight on the nightstand. Sleep came in fits, light and restless. Around 1 in the morning, I heard something again this time, a soft scrape, like something brushing against the wall outside. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved along the wall, then stopped. My skin prickled. I lay there for a long time, every muscle tense, until finally I heard it again, farther away this time. Eventually, silence returned. By the third day, I was starting to feel uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the sounds. It was the sense of being alone but not entirely alone, as if the forest was holding someone else I couldn't see. I thought about cutting my trip short, but I told myself I was overreacting. I kept busy, collected some fallen branches for kindling, cleaned up the small porch, and even tried to sketch the view from the ridge. Still, every time I stepped outside, my eyes scanned the tree line, looking for movement. That night was worse. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something metallic, a faint clink, like a piece of metal tapping another. I lay frozen, listening. Came again, sharper this time, and I realized it was coming from the direction of the porch. My heart pounded. I thought about the lock, about the chair wedged under the knob. The sound stopped for a few minutes, then started again, softer. I stayed in bed until the first hint of dawn. When I finally went out that morning, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The latch on one of the shutters had been undone. It wasn't broken, just unhooked, as if someone had been looking inside. I stood there staring at it, trying to think of a reason why it would be like that. I knew I hadn't left it open. The rest of the day, I couldn't relax. Every sound made me glance toward the windows. I kept the curtains drawn. I ate without tasting my food. I checked my phone, but there was no service. In the afternoon, I packed my things into my bag, planning to leave in the morning. But as the sun went down, I realized how long the drive back to the main road would be, and decided it was safer to stay put until daylight. That last night was the worst of all. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The boards creaked under the weight. They moved toward the door, stopped, then shifted toward the window. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might shake the bed. I grabbed the flashlight but didn't turn it on. I just lay there, barely breathing. The footsteps moved away, then came back. I thought I heard the door handle rattle just once, faint but deliberate. Then nothing. The silence stretched on until my ears rang. I stayed awake until I saw the first gray light of dawn seeping around the edges of the curtains. When I finally stepped outside, the porch boards still showed faint scuff marks, like the dirt had been disturbed by a boot sole. I didn't look around. I just loaded my bags into the car, started the engine, and drove away without glancing back at the cabin. On the drive out, the forest seemed different, less peaceful, more watchful. The road felt longer than before, the trees pressing closer. When I finally reached the main road, I felt something loosen inside me, like I'd been holding my breath for days. I never booked another stay in a remote cabin again. The quiet I'd been craving had turned into something else entirely, something I didn't ever want to feel again. I had been needing a break from the noise for a long time. The months had blurred together with work, traffic, and the same streets over and over again. I wanted something quiet, something where I could hear my own thoughts without the hum of a refrigerator or the distant whine of sirens in the city. When I looked at maps, my eyes kept drifting to a cluster of state land about a 4-hour drive north. It wasn't a park with guided trails or campgrounds, just an expanse of woods, lakes, and some scattered private parcels. On a small listing site, I saw an old timber cabin for rent. The description made it sound almost too plain. No electricity, no plumbing, no phone service. The photos showed a squat, square building with gray wood and a pitched roof, surrounded by tall pines. The place looked like it had been sitting there for decades without anyone caring if it blended in or not. That was what I liked about it. I didn't want cute curtains or cozy marketing shots of coffee mugs on the porch. I wanted it raw and functional, a place you had to adapt to instead of it adapting to you. I packed heavier than I normally would. The listing said there was a wood stove and an old propane cooktop, so I brought my own propane canisters in case the ones there were empty. I filled a cooler with food that would last without refrigeration for a few days and brought water jugs in case the pump was dry. In the back of my SUV, I stacked a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a foam mat, a few changes of clothes, and my old field pack. The last stretch of the drive was a single-lane dirt road that seemed to go on forever. The trees pressed close, leaning over the road in some spots like they were trying to touch branches. My tires crackled over gravel and spat dust behind me. The GPS had stopped updating 30 minutes earlier, so I was following the written directions I'd printed out. When I finally saw the cabin, it was almost too quick. One turn and it was just there, off to the right, with no clearing around it except for a small hardpack space where you could park a vehicle. The rest was thick trees and undergrowth. I stepped out and felt the air differently, sharper, cleaner. There was no wind, but the scent of pine was strong, mixed with damp earth. I unlocked the cabin door with the code I'd been given and pushed it open. The inside was exactly as pictured. Bare wood walls, no insulation visible, a low ceiling that made the room feel smaller. The wood stove sat in one corner on a patch of stone, with a small stack of split logs beside it. There was a table with 2 chairs, an old dresser, and a narrow cot with a thin mattress. I unpacked slowly, listening to how quiet it was. My boots on the floorboards were the only noise. Every sound seemed to hang in the air longer than normal. The first night, I kept things simple. I made a quick meal on the cooktop, ate at the table, and went outside before sunset to walk a bit. The cabin sat about 50 yards from a slope that led down toward a small stream. I could hear the water faintly if I stood still. The trees on the other side of the slope were denser, darker. I didn't go far not because I was worried about getting lost, but because it felt like the kind of place where you should learn the shape of the land slowly. When I returned to the cabin, I lit a lantern, got the wood stove going, and read until my eyes felt heavy. I remember thinking it was exactly what I wanted. Simple, isolated, almost boring. That changed the second night. It started with small things, or maybe I just noticed them more because there was nothing else to focus on. While walking earlier that afternoon, I found a set of tire tracks in the dirt road about half a mile from the cabin. The thing was, the tread looked fresh, and I hadn't heard or seen another vehicle since I got there. The cabin wasn't on the way to anywhere else. You'd only be on that road if you were coming here. I told myself it could be a hunter or someone checking their own land nearby. When I came back from that walk, I saw that the stack of split wood beside the cabin looked different. A few logs were lying on the ground like they'd been knocked over. I hadn't been in a rush when I'd first used it, so I was sure I stacked them evenly. I res-tacked them without thinking too much about it. That night, I woke to a sound outside. It wasn't an animal sound, no rustle of leaves or snap of twigs, it was sharper, like something solid had hit the outer wall. I lay still, my eyes open in the dark, and listened. The lantern had burned out hours earlier, so the cabin was completely black inside. After maybe 30 seconds, I heard the sound again, from the side near the door. I got up quietly and moved to the window. The glass was old and slightly wavy, and I could barely make out the shape of the porch. I didn't see anything moving, but my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I waited there for a long time until the cold in the cabin made me get back under the sleeping bag. The morning felt normal again. I made coffee, ate, and walked farther out along the stream, finding a narrow animal trail that wound through the trees. I didn't see anyone or anything unusual, but that night the sound came back. This time it was slower, spaced out, a knock, then a pause, then another. I didn't get up to look. I just stayed still until it stopped. By the fourth night, I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. It wasn't paranoia. It was the sense that someone was coming close to the cabin but not trying to talk or be seen. That day, I noticed footprints in the damp ground behind the cabin, where the soil stayed soft from the shade. They were boot prints, bigger than mine, and there were at least 3 partial ones heading toward the trees. I spent that afternoon gathering more wood and keeping busy, but I kept glancing toward the tree line. I could almost convince myself I was imagining it, until I saw movement. Just the shift of shadow where it shouldn't have been, too low for a deer and too steady for the wind. That night, I didn't sleep much. I stayed in the chair with the lantern lit until well past midnight. At some point, I heard it again, the knocking, but now closer together, and a faint crunch in the dirt outside like someone stepping carefully. By the 6th day, I was done pretending I wasn't in the middle of something. The prints were back behind the cabin, more of them and fresh. Whoever it was had been circling. I packed my gear quietly that afternoon, loaded it into the SUV, and waited until dusk. If they were watching, I didn't want to give them a full daylight view of me leaving. I drove out without headlights for the first quarter mile, then turned them on and didn't stop until I hit pavement. When I finally pulled over at a gas station 2 hours away, I got out to stretch. My vehicle was covered in a layer of dried mud from the road except for the rear bumper. There, smeared along the metal, was the clear imprint of a hand. The fingers dragged slightly as if someone had gripped it while I was parked at the cabin. The mud had been wiped away under it, clean enough to show the paint. I didn't go back to that place. I didn't tell the owner what happened. There was nothing to explain without sounding like I was making it up. But the image of that handprint stays with me not because of what it meant, but because of what it didn't. Whoever it was never tried to break in. They just stayed close enough to touch, waiting for something I never wanted to find out. had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The plan was simple: get away from the noise of the city, the constant traffic, the smell of exhaust fumes, and the ringing of my phone. I had rented a small wooden cabin deep in the northern woods, far from the nearest paved road. It was early January, which meant snow would be thick on the ground, and the air would be dry and bitterly cold. The cabin was nothing fancy, just a one-room structure with a small kitchen area, a wood stove for heat, a cot, and a bathroom with a compost toilet. It had no electricity, only a couple of oil lamps and candles, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. That was exactly what I wanted. No one around, just silence, the snow, and the woods. The drive to get there was long. I left the main road and drove down a narrow, icy track that was barely wide enough for my truck. Snow-covered pine trees leaned in from both sides, their branches heavy with ice. The sound of my tires crunching over frozen ground was the only noise for miles. My phone had already lost service before I was even halfway there. I reached the cabin in the late afternoon. The sun was already low in the sky, and the temperature was dropping fast. The place looked exactly like the picture's small, square, with a steep roof to keep the snow from piling up too much. Smoke from the last renter's fire had left black marks on the chimney. The front steps creaked under my boots as I went up to unlock the door. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke and old pine. The wooden floor had scuff marks from years of boots and furniture being dragged around. A small stack of firewood sat in the corner, along with a splitting axe leaning against the wall. I could see my breath inside, so the first thing I did was kneel down and start a fire in the stove. It took a while for the place to warm up, so I kept my jacket and gloves on as I unpacked. I had brought plenty of food, mostly canned stuff and things that didn't need refrigeration. Since there was no fridge, just a wooden box outside I could use as a makeshift cold storage. My sleeping bag was rated for extreme cold, so I knew I'd be fine at night once I got the fire going strong. By the time I had everything set up, night had fully fallen. The woods outside were pitch black. No moon, no stars, just a black wall pressing against the little bubble of light spilling from the cabin windows. I ate a simple dinner by the stove, listening to the fire pop and crackle. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. The first night was uneventful. I slept soundly, the sound of wind faint through the walls. But the second day I noticed something odd. It was around noon, and I had been out gathering more firewood from the small pile stacked behind the cabin. The snow back there was deep and untouched, except for my own tracks from earlier. But this time there were other prints. Not boot prints, these were wider, heavier, and spaced strangely, as if whoever made them had been walking slowly and carefully. They came from the woods, stopped near the back wall of the cabin, then turned around and went back into the trees. At first, I thought maybe it was a hunter or a hiker, but it was odd that they would come so close without knocking or announcing themselves. I brushed it off and kept working, but I found myself looking over my shoulder more than usual that afternoon. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind had picked up, rattling the thin windows, and the cabin groaned in the cold. Every so often, I thought I heard something faint outside, like snow crunching under weight, but whenever I sat up and listened hard, it was gone. On the third day, I decided to walk further into the woods, following the trail that led away from the cabin. The snow was deep enough that walking was slow, and the silence was heavy. No birds, no distant hum of traffic, just the sound of my boots breaking through the crust of snow. After about an hour, I reached a small frozen stream. The ice was covered in a thin layer of snow, but I could still make out faint lines where the water had flowed before freezing. That's when I saw them again, those same strange tracks, coming from the opposite side of the stream. They crossed over and disappeared into the trees in the direction of my cabin. I followed them for a while, but the snow was soft in places, and it was hard to keep track. Eventually, I turned back, telling myself it was just some local out hunting or maybe a trapper checking lines. Still, I didn't see any other sign of human activity. No old cans, no cigarette butts, no scraps of paper. When I got back, I checked the back of the cabin again. The old prints from before were still there, but now there were fresh ones mixed in, leading right up to the small window above the sink. I didn't like that. I didn't like it at all. That night, I made sure the fire was going strong before I crawled into my sleeping bag. I kept my boots next to me, just in case I had to get up quickly. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke suddenly to the sound of snow crunching right outside the wall behind my head. I lay completely still, holding my breath. The sound was slow, deliberate crunch, pause, crunch, then it stopped. I strained my ears, but the silence pressed in again. I waited what felt like an hour before finally drifting back to an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I went out to check. Sure enough, there were fresh tracks circling the cabin. They stayed close to the walls, stopping at each window before moving on. Whoever it was had walked a complete loop around the building before heading back into the trees. From that point on, I couldn't relax. Every noise made me jump. I kept the axe closer to the stove, where I could reach it in a hurry. I started stacking firewood inside, not because I needed it, but because I didn't want to go outside more than I had to. The fourth night was the worst. I had been sitting by the stove, reading by lamplight, when I heard it again, snow crunching outside, slow and careful. This time, it didn't fade away. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, pausing every few steps. I could picture someone standing just beyond the glow of the window, watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there, back against the wall, listening to the fire burn low. By morning, the tracks were there again, but this time they didn't lead back into the woods. They just stopped about 20 feet from the cabin. The snow beyond was untouched. I had another 2 nights before I was supposed to leave, but I made up my mind right then I was getting out that day. I packed quickly, keeping one eye on the tree line the whole time. The silence was thicker than ever. When I finally started the truck and pulled onto the narrow track back toward the main road, I felt my chest loosen for the first time in days. But about a mile from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the gap in the trees, I saw a dark figure standing where the track curved, half hidden in the shadows. Just standing there, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until the cabin was miles behind me, and I didn't look back again. That was the first and last time I ever rented a place that far out. I never found out who had been there or why they kept coming so close, but I know one thing: those tracks weren't there by accident. It started as a way to get away from the noise. Life had been eating at me in quiet, unnoticeable ways for months. Every day was a copy of the last, and every night I fell asleep with my phone still in my hand. I told myself I just needed a few days away from screens, from traffic, from people. Somewhere I could wake up to nothing but the wind through trees. That's how I ended up with the cabin. It was a small place, deep in the northern pines, far enough from town that the last part of the drive was just dirt road winding into thicker and thicker forest. I had found it through a private rental listing, an old place someone had fixed up for quiet retreats. The photos online showed a single-story structure of dark wood, a porch running along the front, and a small clearing where grass fought to grow between pine needles. The price was low enough to feel like a steal, but not so low that it set off alarms in my head. The drive out was calm enough. Asphalt gave way to gravel, then gravel gave way to dirt. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of people there were. The sky was a sharp blue between the tall, straight pines. Their trunks stood close together like soldiers, their shadows creating patterns on the road that shifted with the wind. I passed one small, rusted sign that looked like it hadn't been read in years. When I reached the cabin, I noticed immediately that the photos hadn't lied. The wood siding was dark from age but solid. The porch creaked when I stepped on it, but only in the way old wood always does. The front door opened with a stiff turn of the key. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine and something old but not unpleasant. A small kitchen took up one side of the main room, with counters worn smooth from years of use. The rest of the space held a couch, a wood stove, and a table by the window. The bedroom was barely big enough for a double bed and a narrow dresser. The bathroom was small but clean, with a curtain over the shower rod that swayed slightly in the draft. Felt like the right kind of quiet. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle into the stillness. The air was cool inside, and when I opened a window, I heard nothing except the faint rush of wind through the treetops. No cars, no people, just the kind of silence that seemed to reach inside you and make you breathe slower. That first night, I fell asleep early, the bed softer than I expected. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up. No reason for it, just sudden awareness, my eyes opening to darkness. The cabin was almost pitch black except for a faint strip of moonlight slipping through the curtains. I lay still, listening. Nothing but the wind again, maybe an owl in the distance. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The second day, I walked the area. The dirt road continued past the cabin but quickly became overgrown. There were no other houses nearby, no signs of recent traffic. I found a narrow trail leading off into the trees behind the cabin and followed it for a while. The forest here was dense. Pines, maples, and thick underbrush. Fallen branches crunched under my boots. I kept walking until I realized I hadn't brought anything with me, not even water, and turned back. That night, I heard it. It was faint, far off at first. A rhythmic crunch of leaves, uneven but steady. I sat up in bed, my ears straining in the silence. The sound stopped. I waited, barely breathing, but the forest went still again. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just a deer moving through. The third day, I noticed something strange. I had left my boots by the porch steps overnight, caked in dried mud from my walk. That morning, they were sitting in the same place, but the laces were untied. Not loose, but completely undone, the ends resting on the boards. I never left them like that. I tied them without thinking much about it, but a small unease stayed with me. That night, the footsteps came closer. I woke to them again, this time nearer to the cabin. Slow, deliberate crunches on the pine needles and leaves. They stopped for long stretches, as if whoever or whatever was making them was pausing to listen. My skin prickled. I stayed completely still, not daring to move to the window. When I woke in the morning, I checked outside. Nothing obvious. The ground was covered in needles that made it hard to see prints, but I could have sworn some patches looked pressed down in narrow shapes, almost like shoe impressions. I told myself it was nothing. The fourth night, I didn't sleep well. I kept the small lamp on, the warm light pooling over the bed. The silence seemed heavier now, as if the forest itself was waiting for something. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the lamp still on and the distinct sound of wood creaking outside. Not just the wind moving the porch boards. These were heavier, spaced footsteps. They moved across the porch slowly, each step deliberate. My throat felt tight. I didn't move. After a long minute, the sound stopped. I waited in that stillness for what felt like hours before I fell asleep again. The next morning, I checked the porch. Near the steps, in the thin layer of dust and dirt on the boards, there was a faint mark, the tread pattern of a shoe. By now, I was considering leaving early, but the rental was paid for, and I kept thinking maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the mark was mine from earlier in the day. Maybe the creaks were just the old cabin shifting. That night, I made sure the doors were locked. I even slid one of the chairs under the front door handle. I didn't expect the sound to come from the back. Sometime deep in the night, I woke to a soft scrape against the back wall of the cabin, like something dragging lightly along the wood siding. It moved slowly, stopping, then starting again. My heart thudded in my chest. I stayed frozen until it stopped. When I finally slept, it was restless and shallow. By morning, I decided I would leave the next day, but that final night would be the worst. It started the same, the crunch of leaves somewhere out in the dark. Then closer, then the porch steps, then the slow creak of weight on the boards. I lay rigid in bed, my mind racing. Then came the faint sound of the door handle turning. It was locked. The handle turned again, harder this time, then stopped. Silence followed, heavy and total. And then the sound of something brushing against the bedroom window. That was when I slid quietly from the bed, grabbed my bag, and moved toward the front. I didn't turn on a light. My breathing sounded loud in my own ears. I pulled the chair from the door, unlocked it, and stepped into the night. The air was cold, my breath white in the moonlight. I walked quickly to my car, parked just off the porch. The forest around me seemed impossibly still. Once inside the car, I locked the doors and started the engine. Headlights cut through the trees, and in that beam, I thought I saw a shape tall, still, standing just beyond the first row of pines. I didn't wait to look longer. The dirt road felt longer on the way out. Every turn seemed to take too long. Every shadow seemed to follow. By the time I reached the main road, the tension in my chest began to ease. I never went back. A week later, curiosity got the better of me, and I searched the cabin's address online again. This time, I dug deeper. I found an old forum post from years ago, written by someone who had stayed there. They mentioned hearing footsteps at night and finding their boots untied in the morning. I had been working without a break for months, barely noticing the days pass. I was constantly surrounded by noise, bright screens, and the stale smell of my apartment. One morning I realized that the only fresh air I had breathed in the last 2 weeks came from opening my kitchen window for a few seconds while making coffee. I needed a reset. I didn't want to go to a resort or a beach or some crowded tourist spot. I wanted somewhere quiet, out of the way, where I could just be still. I went online and started looking for cabins. Not the fancy ones with hot tubs and flat-screen TVs, but something plain, maybe even old, with enough space for me to be alone and think. I found a listing for a small cabin at a place called Miller's Creek, about 5 hours north. The pictures weren't great, just a few shots of a weathered wooden cabin, a creek in the background, and some pine trees. The ad said it was remote, peaceful, and perfect for those wanting to disconnect. That was exactly what I needed. I booked it for a week. The drive up there was long but steady. The farther I went, the more the scenery changed. Gas stations and fast food places gave way to stretches of forest, long empty roads, and wide open fields where the grass bent with the wind. The sky was pale and hazy, and the air through the open car window was cooler than I'd expected for summer. I stopped once for gas and a sandwich, then kept going until I reached the narrow dirt road that led to Miller's Creek. It felt like I drove forever on that dirt road. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches forming a tunnel overhead. My tires crunched over gravel and loose soil, and the occasional branch scraped along the side of the car. The road dipped and curved in ways that made me slow down more than I wanted to, and more than once I caught myself wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn. Just when I was about to check my phone for directions, I came around a bend and saw it, the cabin. It was smaller than I'd pictured. The wood was dark and weathered, with patches of moss on the lower walls. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows looked old, like the glass had bubbled in places over the years. The porch was only a few steps wide, with a single wooden chair and a railing that leaned to one side. Off to the right, maybe 30 feet away, I could hear the creek rushing. The sound was steady and deep, like water hitting rocks. I parked in the small clearing beside the cabin, got out, and stretched. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper. I could hear the water, the rustle of the trees, and somewhere far off, a bird calling. There was no hum of traffic, no voices, no music, just open quiet. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living space with a couch, a table, and a wood stove. A tiny kitchen with an old electric stove and a fridge that hummed loudly. The bedroom was just big enough for a bed and a narrow dresser. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I could see faint marks in the wood where furniture had been moved over the years. There was no TV, no internet, and barely enough cell service to send a text. I unpacked my bag, put my food in the fridge, and then walked outside to explore. Behind the cabin, a narrow path led down toward the creek. The ground was uneven, with roots and stones sticking out. The water was wider than I'd expected, maybe 20 feet across, with smooth rocks in the middle where the current slowed. The banks were damp, and there were small plants growing close to the edge. I crouched down, ran my hand through the cold water, and felt an odd shiver run up my arm. It wasn't unpleasant, just sharper than I'd anticipated. The first 2 days were peaceful. I woke with the sun, made coffee, and sat on the porch listening to the creek. I walked the trails nearby, took pictures of plants and old tree stumps, and even sat by the water for hours doing nothing. At night, the temperature dropped, and the air in the cabin grew cold enough that I had to pull the blankets tight. I slept deeply, waking only once or twice to shift position. It was on the third night that things began to feel different. That evening, I went for a walk just before sunset. The light was dim and soft, with long shadows stretching between the trees. I wandered farther than usual, following a deer trail that split off from the main path. The ground here was softer, covered in pine needles. I noticed then that the forest felt strangely still. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, except for the occasional shift of the wind. I stopped walking and listened. Nothing. When I turned back toward the cabin, I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, like I wasn't alone. It wasn't an obvious sound, no footsteps, no voices, but the feeling was sharp enough to make me walk faster. By the time I reached the cabin, the light had faded almost completely, and the first stars were showing through the darkening sky. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. A single crack, like a branch snapping under weight. My eyes opened instantly, and I lay there in the dark, listening. The creek was still running, the wind still moved through the trees, but there it was again, another snap, closer this time. My chest felt tight. I didn't move. I didn't even shift the blankets. The sound stopped after a while, and I eventually fell back asleep, though not as deeply as before. The next day, I noticed something near the edge of the creek. Footprints. Not boot prints like mine, but bare feet. The ground there was muddy, and the prints were clear enough to show toes and the curve of a heel. They weren't huge, maybe the size of my own feet, but the idea of someone walking barefoot along the creek in the night unsettled me. I kept telling myself they could have been old, maybe from a swimmer or fisherman, but the mud didn't look dry. That night, I checked the lock on the door 3 times before bed. I closed the curtains tight. I lay there in the dark, listening harder than I wanted to. The sound came again. Soft, deliberate movement outside. Not close enough to touch the cabin, but not far away either. The creek covered some of the noise, but I could still hear the faint crunch of earth, the occasional scrape of something against wood. The following morning, I saw something else. Near the trees behind the cabin, where the ground was damp, there was a fresh mark in the dirt. It looked like someone had crouched there, both feet pressed down and a knee mark between them. The thought of someone crouching outside my cabin, watching, made my skin feel too tight. I decided to cut my trip short. That last night was the worst. I barely slept. Every sound felt magnified: the wind in the trees, the creak of the cabin's frame, the rush of the creek. Sometime after midnight, I heard the crunch of footsteps again. Slower now, closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then, faint but clear, the sound of wood shifting the porch. My stomach dropped. The air in the room felt heavier. I stayed still, not moving, not even blinking. After what felt like minutes, the sound moved away, fading toward the creek. I didn't sleep again after that. I lay there until the first light of morning, then packed my things and loaded the car as fast as I could. As I drove back down the dirt road, I caught one last glimpse of the cabin in my rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something at the edge of the trees. A person, standing still, watching the car go. By the time I looked again, the space was empty. I didn't stop until I was miles away, and even then I kept checking my mirrors. The whole drive home, I kept thinking about those barefoot prints by the creek, the crouched marks in the dirt, and the sound of slow, deliberate steps on the porch. I never went back to Miller's Creek. I had never planned on staying at the cabin for more than a week, but things in my life had a way of drifting off course, and that trip to Miller's Creek turned into something much longer and far more unsettling than I ever expected. It was late October when I drove up, the last of the bright autumn leaves still clinging to the trees, with most already carpeting the ground in deep orange and brown layers. The air was cold but still, carrying the smell of wet earth and distant pine. The cabin sat about 5 miles from the nearest paved road. The dirt road leading up to it twisted through dense forest and passed over 2 narrow wooden bridges before opening into a small clearing. The clearing was surrounded on all sides by tall trees, and the sunlight only reached the place for a few hours each day before shadows stretched across the grass and gravel. The cabin itself was small and old, built decades ago. Its roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the wood siding had gone gray from years of weather. There was a small porch on the front with 2 rotting chairs, one of them missing a leg. I had rented it from an old man I met in town 2 weeks earlier. He told me it had no internet, no phone line, and the nearest neighbor was about 2 miles through the woods. I wanted peace, quiet, and a chance to work on some writing without distractions, so I agreed. At the time, the idea of being completely alone sounded good. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old wood smoke and damp. There was a single main room with a stone fireplace, a small table, and 2 chairs. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. The bedroom had 1 small window and a bed with a lumpy mattress. The bathroom had only cold running water, which the old man told me came from a well out back. There was no central heat, just the fireplace and a small wood-burning stove in the corner of the main room. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, stacked firewood inside, and explored a little around the property. Behind the cabin, the ground sloped down toward Miller's Creek, which was narrow but fast-moving, its water icy cold. I followed it upstream for a while until the sun began to drop, then returned to the cabin and made a fire. At night, the woods were silent in a way that made me uneasy. There was no hum of traffic, no distant voices, just the occasional pop from the fireplace and the sound of wind moving through the trees. That first night I slept deeply, wrapped in blankets, listening to the crackle of the fire. The next day, I decided to walk farther out along the dirt road to see where it led beyond the cabin. About a mile from the clearing, I found the remnants of an old wooden sign lying half buried in the weeds. The paint was faded, but I could still make out the words "Private Property" in large block letters. The boards looked weathered and broken, as though they had been lying there for years. I kept walking until I reached a point where the road narrowed and seemed less traveled. Fallen leaves covered most of it, and the ruts looked old. Something about the way the road seemed to close in made me turn back. The sun was already lower in the sky, and I didn't want to be caught out after dark. That evening, I was sitting at the table writing when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, just the crunch of leaves underfoot. I froze, listening. Came again, closer this time, moving slowly across the clearing. The sound stopped near the porch. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear anything else. A moment later, there was a dull thump, as if something heavy had been set down against the porch boards. I moved quietly to the window and looked out, but the porch was empty. The only thing I could see was the dark line of trees at the edge of the clearing. After a while, I convinced myself it was probably just an animal. I tried to get back to writing, but I found myself glancing at the window every few minutes. The next morning, I went outside to check. The grass near the porch was pressed down in places, as if something had stood there. The marks weren't clear footprints, more like patches where the ground had been disturbed. I noticed something else. The small pile of split firewood I kept stacked neatly on one side of the porch had been shifted. 2 pieces were lying on the porch floor, side by side, as if someone had taken them out and then set them down again. I tried to reason it away. Maybe the wind had knocked them over. Maybe an animal had nosed at them. Still, the placement was strange. Too neat. I kept busy that day, chopping more wood, walking the perimeter of the clearing, and checking the creek for fresh water. The air was colder now, and the weather forecast from the old man before I arrived had mentioned an early snow. By evening, I had built up the fire and settled in to read. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of scraping. It was faint but steady, like wood being dragged slowly across the porch boards. My heart pounded as I lay there in the dark, listening. The noise went on for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. When I went out in the morning, I found 2 of the porch chairs moved several feet from where they had been. One was turned toward the tree line. The other was angled toward the cabin door. By now, I felt sure someone had been on the property during the night. I didn't have a phone, so there was no easy way to call for help. I could leave, but the nearest town was far, and part of me didn't want to run over something that might have been nothing more than a prank. Still, I began keeping a hatchet near the bed. Days passed, and the disturbances continued. Some mornings I would find small piles of leaves arranged in odd patterns near the porch steps. Once, a length of rope from the shed was lying coiled on the ground just outside my bedroom window. Then one night, just after I had banked the fire and was lying in bed, I heard the sound of something tapping against the wall of the cabin. The taps were spaced apart, slow and deliberate. They started at one end of the wall and moved gradually toward the bedroom window. I didn't move. My breathing was shallow, my ears straining. When the tapping reached the window, it stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the noise itself. The next morning, I found a long, thin scratch running from the corner of the window frame down toward the ground. It looked fresh, the wood pale and exposed where it had been scraped. By now, I was sleeping less and less. I would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound outside. The weather turned colder, and a light snow began to fall at night, melting by midday. This gave me a way to track what was happening. Footprints. The first morning after the snow, I went outside early and saw them. Not animal tracks, these were the clear impressions of boots. They came from the woods, circled the cabin twice, and then led back into the trees. I followed them as far as I could, but they disappeared into a dense patch of undergrowth. My hands were shaking by the time I returned to the cabin. That night, I stayed up with the fire burning low, waiting. Around 2 in the morning, I saw movement outside the window. Just a shadow at first, slipping between the trees, then the faint outline of a person standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. They didn't move. They just stood there, facing the cabin. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the 4th week, I had stopped venturing far from the cabin. I kept all the doors barred from the inside and slept with the hatchet within arm's reach. Every sound put me on edge: the crack of ice in the creek of wood in the wind. I knew someone was out there watching. One morning, I stepped outside and saw a single boot print on the porch, dusted with fresh snow. It was positioned directly in front of the door, toes pointing toward it, as if the person had stood there for a long time before leaving. I had reached my limit. I packed my things, loaded the car, and drove out. As I crossed the second wooden bridge, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the trees, just barely visible, I saw a figure standing in the clearing where the cabin sat. They didn't follow. When I reached town, I went straight to the sheriff's office and explained what had been happening. The deputy took notes and said they would send someone out to check, but a week later I got a brief message through the rental contact. They had found no one. The old man never offered to rent me the cabin again, and I never asked. Even now, months later, I still think about those nights at Miller's Creek. I can picture the tracks in the snow, the chairs moved on the porch, the silent figure standing just beyond the trees. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I know they were real, and I know they were watching me, waiting for something. It was early January when I decided to spend a week alone in the mountains. I had been feeling worn down from the last few months: too many hours at work, too many late nights in the city, too much noise. I wanted quiet. I wanted to wake up and hear only the sound of wind and trees instead of traffic and neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls. A friend of mine had a cabin in the northern range, tucked far away from any main road. He told me it was empty most of the winter because it was a pain to reach when the snow got bad. The place had no TV, no internet, and barely enough cell signal to send a text if you stood by the kitchen window. I thought it sounded perfect. Getting there wasn't easy. I drove 6 hours north until the highway narrowed into a twisting road that wound between thick pines. Snowbanks rose on both sides like frozen walls. When I finally reached the dirt track leading to the cabin, it was buried under several inches of snow, untouched except for faint animal tracks crossing it here and there. The last mile was too deep for my car, so I parked off to the side and loaded my gear into a sled I had brought. The air was biting cold, sharp in my lungs. The snow squeaked under my boots as I pulled the sled behind me. My fingers ached even inside thick gloves. Every few minutes I stopped to breathe and look at the quiet around me, just endless white and black tree trunks stretching into the distance. By the time I reached the cabin, the pale winter light was fading. The place was small, just one main room with a bed tucked into a corner, a wood stove, a small table, and a kitchenette with an old gas range. A short hallway led to a tiny bathroom with a pump sink and compost toilet. The air inside was stale and cold, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. I set my bags down and got the wood stove going first. It took several tries, but soon the fire was crackling, filling the room with heat and the faint scent of pine smoke. I unpacked slowly, putting my food in the pantry and my clothes into a small chest at the foot of the bed. Outside, the wind started to pick up, brushing snow from the branches so it fell in soft, heavy clumps. That first night was quiet. The silence was almost unnatural at first. No hum of appliances, no distant cars, no voices. Just the occasional pop from the wood stove and the faint whine of wind outside. I slept deeply, cocooned in layers of blankets, feeling the kind of rest I hadn't had in months. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The snow was deeper in some spots, and I had to use snowshoes I'd brought to move easily. The cabin sat in a small clearing, but beyond that was dense forest. The ground sloped gradually down toward a frozen creek maybe half a mile away. Animal tracks were everywhere: rabbits, deer, and what I thought might be fox. I followed the creek for a while until the trees thinned, and I found an old wooden footbridge coated in ice. Creaked under my weight. On the far side, the land rose sharply, and I could see through the trees the suggestion of a rocky ridge. I decided I'd hike up there another day when the snow was firmer. That night, the wind was stronger. It rattled the metal chimney pipe and moaned through the trees. I kept the fire going late, and even then, I could feel the cold creeping in from the corners of the cabin. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound: soft, muffled thumps, spaced a few seconds apart. I lay still, listening. The sound came from outside, maybe from the porch. I thought it could be snow sliding off the roof, so I didn't move. Eventually, it stopped, and I drifted back to sleep. On the third day, I woke to find the sky overcast and heavy with snow. By mid-morning, thick flakes were falling, and the forest disappeared into a white haze. I spent most of the day inside, reading by the fire and occasionally glancing at the snow piling up outside. By evening, it was at least a foot deep, erasing any tracks I'd left before. That night, I heard the thumping again. This time, it was closer together, almost like footsteps in the snow. Slow, deliberate. I told myself it was probably a deer passing by, maybe looking for food near the cabin. But as I lay there, I realized the sound stopped right by the front wall and stayed there for a long time. In the morning, I checked outside. There were tracks in the fresh snow, 2 lines of deep prints leading from the trees straight to the cabin. The prints were larger than my boots, and spaced far apart. They circled the cabin once, then went back toward the woods. They didn't look like deer tracks. The shape was wrong, too long in one direction. I told myself it was probably a moose, maybe even a bear wandering out of hibernation early, though I knew bears rarely did that. Either way, I didn't like it. I kept the axe I'd brought leaning against the wall by the bed from then on. The days passed slowly. The snow didn't let up much, and the sky stayed dull and gray. Every morning I went outside to check for new tracks. Sometimes there were none. Sometimes I found the same strange prints again, always approaching from the trees and stopping somewhere near the cabin. I never saw anything moving out there, though. On the 5th night, I woke to a different sound. It was faint scratching, like claws or nails on wood. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and listened. It came from the far side of the cabin, near the kitchen window. The sound would stop for a few seconds, then start again, slightly higher or lower, as if whatever it was moving along the wall. I got up quietly and grabbed the axe. I stood by the stove, watching the window. The glass was dark, reflecting only the dim orange glow from the fire. The scratching stopped, replaced by a faint, slow creak of snow under weight. The sound moved toward the front of the cabin, then faded into the distance. When daylight came, I went outside and followed the prints. They led away from the cabin, through the clearing, and into the trees. I followed for maybe 50 yards before stopping. The forest was silent, the snow untouched except for that single trail of prints. I didn't want to go further. I turned back. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the wood, every shift of the wind made me tense. The fire burned low, but I didn't get up to feed it. I just lay under the blankets, listening to the cold settle into the cabin. On the 6th day, I decided to leave a day early. The weather was supposed to clear, and I didn't want to risk another heavy snow making the path out impassable. I packed slowly, keeping an ear on the forest outside. By late afternoon, I had everything ready near the door. When night fell, I tried to sleep but couldn't. I kept thinking about the prints, the scratching, the feeling of being watched. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. The slow, deliberate crunch of snow. It circled the cabin once, twice. Then it stopped right outside the bedroom wall. I held my breath, gripping the axe, and waited. The sound didn't move for what felt like hours. Then, finally, there was a single heavy thump, as if something had stepped onto the porch. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I threw my pack on, strapped the sled to my waist, and started for the car. The forest was silent, the air painfully cold. The snow crunched under my boots, and my breath hung in front of me. Halfway down the trail, I looked back. The clearing was empty, but fresh tracks led from the trees straight to the cabin door. I didn't stop again until I reached my car. The drive back felt longer than the trip in. Even with the heater blasting, I couldn't shake the cold. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I couldn't explain it myself. All I know is that someone or something was out there every night, moving in the snow, watching the cabin. And I'm not going back to find out what it was. I had rented the cabin for a week, thinking it would be a quiet place to finish some work I had been putting off for months. It was early October, the kind of time when the air has already turned cold, but the trees are still clinging to their last golden and red leaves. The listing had made it seem perfect, a simple wooden cabin at the edge of a lake, far away from any towns, with no close neighbors. The photos showed a big front porch with a railing, a tiny dock leading into still water, and a stretch of forest behind it. I had been craving silence and space. The drive there had taken longer than expected. The last 45 minutes were on an uneven gravel road that seemed to wind forever through dense woods. My car rattled over deep potholes, and the branches overhead made a dark canopy that blocked most of the daylight. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, I felt that small rush you get when you see something familiar from a picture come alive in front of you. It looked exactly like the listing, maybe even more charming in person. The air was so still when I stepped out of the car that I could hear the faint ticking of the engine cooling down. No wind, no birdsong, just the occasional ripple of water from the lake. It was almost too quiet, but I told myself that was exactly what I had come for. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A single main room with a small kitchen against one wall, a wood stove in the center, and a bed tucked into the corner. There was no TV, no internet, and the cell signal had already dropped to nothing a few miles back. I unpacked my things slowly, taking my time to get settled. The first day passed quietly. I made coffee, worked at the small wooden table by the window, and occasionally stepped out to the porch to breathe in the cold air. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the pale sky like glass. That night, I noticed something I hadn't thought much about before, just how dark it could get in a place like this. There were no streetlights, no distant glow of a town on the horizon. When the sun went down, the darkness outside the windows was total. The cabin had a couple of small lamps, but their light felt weak against the blackness pressing in from every side. I closed the curtains before bed, telling myself it was just to keep the heat in. The second day, I explored a little. There was a narrow path behind the cabin that led uphill into the trees. The forest felt dense and close, the kind where sound doesn't travel far. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled. I found what looked like an old, overgrown trail leading off to the right, but I didn't follow it for long. The air felt heavier there, and the ground was soft and uneven with roots. I turned back before going too far. That evening, as I was chopping vegetables for dinner, I thought I heard a faint crunch outside. It wasn't the sound of branches swaying, there was still no wind, but more like a single footstep on leaves. I froze, knife in hand, listening. Nothing followed. After a moment, I went back to cooking, telling myself it was probably an animal. The next day, I woke up earlier than usual, just after sunrise. The light coming through the curtains was thin and pale, and the air in the cabin felt colder than before. I boiled water for coffee and stepped out onto the porch. That's when I noticed something strange. The ground in front of the porch, where the dirt met the grass, had fresh marks, shallow depressions, like someone had stepped there recently. The soil was slightly damp from last night's dew, and the impressions looked crisp, not softened by time. I crouched down to look closer. They weren't shaped clearly enough to tell if they were human or animal, but they were bigger than I would have expected from a raccoon or fox. I told myself it could have been a deer. The thought didn't entirely convince me, but I left it at that. The fourth day was when the unease started to really grow. It rained that morning, a cold, steady drizzle that turned the sky into one flat sheet of gray. The lake rippled constantly under the drops. I stayed inside, working for most of the day, only stopping to make tea or stoke the fire. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped, but the forest felt even quieter than before. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched, even if you can't see anyone. I didn't notice the second set of tracks until after dark. I had stepped out to bring in a few logs for the stove, and in the beam of my flashlight, I saw more impressions in the wet ground. These were closer to the side of the cabin, near the back corner where there were no windows. They were spaced apart in a way that looked deliberate, like someone walking slowly. That night, I barely slept. Every time the old wood of the cabin creaked, I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. I kept telling myself it was just the building settling in the cold, but my mind kept circling back to those tracks. On the fifth day, I decided to walk the perimeter of the property. The cabin didn't have a fence, just a thin stretch of grass before the trees closed in. I moved slowly, looking for more signs of anything unusual. On the far side, where the trees came closest to the building, I found something that made my skin crawl. A cigarette butt. It was fresh enough that the paper hadn't gone soft from the damp air. There was no sign of a campsite nearby, no trail leading to this spot, and I hadn't smoked in years. I stood there for a long time, holding it in my palm, until I finally dropped it and went back inside. That night, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle. I kept the lights off, sitting in the dark with only the faint orange glow from the wood stove. I wanted to see if the quiet would reveal anything, maybe footsteps, maybe movement. Around midnight, I heard it again. A single crunch outside, then another. Slow, deliberate. My pulse thudded in my ears as I sat completely still. The sound stopped for a long time, then came again, this time closer to the porch. I didn't move until dawn. By the sixth day, I knew I couldn't stay the full week. I started packing that morning, trying to move quickly without letting my nervousness take over. But before I could finish, I saw something through the back window. A figure, far enough into the trees that I couldn't make out their face, but close enough that there was no mistaking they were watching. Standing still, half hidden by a tree, just watching. I dropped what I was holding and went straight to the front door. I didn't run, I didn't want to look panicked, but I got into my car and started it as fast as I could. The road out felt longer than it had coming in. Every bend in the trees felt like it was hiding someone. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop driving until I was 2 towns away. Later, I thought about the tracks, the cigarette, the figure. None of it proved anything on its own, but together they formed a picture I didn't want to think too hard about. I never went back to that cabin. The listing disappeared a few months later. And even now, when I think about it, I wonder if the person in the woods had been there since the first night. Watching, waiting,